Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Ukrainian intelligence claim responsibility for killing senior Russian general Igor Kirillo and his assistant in Moscow. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is reportedly travelling to Cairo with the Gaza ceasefire deal expected to be reached within days. Turkey and its Syrian proxies may be preparing for an incursion into areas held by the Kurdish-led Assyrian Democratic Forces. And time with Tyson. The former world heavyweight champion Tyson Fury tells Al Arabiya's Riz Khan why he's looking forward to the World Cup in Saudi Arabia as he prepares for Saturday's rematch with Alexander Usyk in Riyadh. Now to our top story. Ukraine's intelligence services killed the head of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical defensive forces in Moscow earlier today. Igor Kirillo is the most senior Russian official to be assassinated inside the country by Ukraine and was recently charged by Kyiv's security service for the use of a banned chemical weapon. Russia says it's treating the death as a terrorist act and has vowed to get immediate revenge. Let's go live to Moscow to speak to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova, who joins us now. Dasha, thank you for being with us. This must come as a huge blow to President Putin that one of his highest-ranking generals has been killed in this way, and also just so close to the Kremlin.
Well, indeed, there are many speculations with regard to how that was allowed to happen and why security for one of Russia's top generals was actually that weak that it had happened. Now, we understand the Kremlin has remained tight-lipped on this matter. However, the Russian officials have all been saying that there has to be the retaliation for these acts of terrorism. Some have also concluded that Ukraine is likely behind this assassination. Ukraine itself has claimed responsibility as we get media reports, but also in Moscow there have been calls to bring those accountable to justice. The Russian mission to the United Nations has also said that this issue will be discussed at the UN Security Council. They do want to see the international community's condemnation of these acts of terrorism. And many officials in Moscow, including Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev, have been saying that this is the act of desperation in which Kyiv is trying to prove that they are still capable of something and show that to the Western countries. Meanwhile, Moscow insists that this will indeed be responded to. But at the same time, we also hear the political analysts here in Moscow suggesting that this could be yet another attempt by the outgoing Biden administration to destroy the potential for the reconstruction of ties between Moscow and Washington or any peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine.
Dasha, we've seen pictures of the exploding scooter. What have Russian authorities discovered about this attack so far?
Well, we know that the investigators and forensic experts have worked at the scene for about 11 hours, and they, according to some reports, have taken the car of Igor Kirillo from that he used and was given to him by the Russian Ministry of Defense from that scene. We don't know more information with regards to anything that has happened there, but the preliminary information suggests that indeed the explosive device was installed in the rental scooter that was parked in front of the apartment building from which Kirillo was leaving this morning. Now, on these pictures, we are seeing this explosion being that heavy that it also damaged the building and the cars that have been parked nearby. So the investigation is ongoing, and the investigative committee has said that it is treating this assassination as an act of terrorism.
Kirillo had been accused of using banned chemical weapons during the war with Ukraine. Is this why he was targeted, possibly?
Well, Well, indeed, we have heard that this incident has taken place a day after he was charged in absentia in Ukraine. Moscow, however, has always been denying any such claims. Now, we also know Igor Kirillo as the person who was given regular briefings in which he was alleging that the United States, the Western countries, as well as Kyiv, have had the whole network of secret biolabs that have been developing different chemical agents and different attacks being perpetrated by the Western countries against Russia. This is actually how Kirillo has grown to eminence over the course of the past 2 years. And in Moscow, some officials have said that somebody felt threatened by the evidence and by the things that Kirillo has been bringing to the public, and that's why this assassination took place.
Dasha, Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you for joining us. Let's get into this further with former British Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood, who joins us now. Tobias, thank you very much. We've been hearing the background there from Dasha, who's in Moscow, but tell us what an attack like this actually means for Ukraine's allies.
Well, it's going to boost the confidence and the morale of the Ukrainians, particularly as we lead up to January the 20th. And as we all know, that date is significant. Both sides, Russia and Ukraine, know there's simply just 1 month left until Donald Trump returns to the White House, which will place huge pressure on both sides for this ceasefire, potential discussions for a political agreement of some form, a deal and so forth. So every opportunity to gain territory, to seek an advantage or to prosecute existing plans to cause harm will be expedited before time runs out. So the killing of Lieutenant General Igor Kirillo is a major event. The removal of this senior military officer, not on the battlefield, but in Moscow, just miles from the Kremlin. This will be a huge embarrassment for Putin. He cannot hide from this, from the Russian people. They're very weary of this war, not least because of the cost of Russian lives, but also the impact on its economy. So I would expect, as you've just been discussing, a major retaliation on the Russian side itself.
Tobias, you mentioned Donald Trump there returning to the White House and lots of tactics going on at the moment when it comes to Ukraine and it also comes to Russia. But do you think there'll be a ceasefire between the two when Trump takes office?
Well, that is the big question. He's made these big promises that he can somehow resolve this matter in 24, 48 hours. That either suggests that in the lead up to January the 20th, a lot of homework will be done. So when he enters office, he can then say, look, I've got the agreements. I'm going to bring people around the table. And that's it. We're back to the negotiations and the ceasefire can begin almost immediately. Or we simply take this with a pinch of salt, like so many other times he's actually spoken during the campaign rallies. But the bigger picture is this war has now been raging for almost 3 years. And there's a fundamental question as to why the largest, most potent military alliance the world has ever seen in the form of NATO wasn't able to put this fire out. That somehow the bully has been able to get away with gaining territory, 1/5 of another country, and the West wasn't able to stand up to this. So there could easily be an agreement, but it leaves Putin in office. It leaves Putin to rearm, regroup, and fight again. And that's the most dangerous aspect of this, because as I've been saying in Britain, and indeed others have been saying in America as well, this isn't about Ukraine. This is about an ideological threat that Putin poses as it saddles up with China to reinterpret our global order. And it won't stop in Ukraine. His battle will continue beyond that. And that's what we need to wake up to and persuade the American president, the new American president coming back into the White House, exactly what Putin's longer-term intentions actually are.
But if we look at the longer-term picture you've been speaking about there to me, the UK's Ministry of Defence claims Russia has lost more than 11,000 tanks and armoured vehicles since this invasion began, Tobias. In your opinion, how long can Russia carry on this war? How is it going to sustain itself?
Well, this is perhaps the power, the lure that Putin actually has over his own people. He was seen as the savior, when the collapse of the Soviet Union, to come back in and give a sense of gravitas, a sense of purpose of rebuilding Russia. So many of the Russian people see him as the savior, and so they tolerate Putin and what he's actually doing here. There's also the longer-term issues that Russia is able to endure hardship in a much higher level than the West is. When we lose troops on the ground and so forth, there's an immediate pressure in the public debate, to withdraw, to remove, to retreat, and so forth. But the motherland is able to continue going. He's moved his country to a war footing and determined to see this out. And perhaps that's what's tested the West's appetite to provide and continue support for Ukraine. But we've been spooked from the very start by Putin's rhetoric about wanting to go nuclear, about the escalator ladder, climbing out of control, rather than showing some, Cold War statecraft. We've got there, and actually much to the thanks of the British, to provide main battle tanks, to provide the F-16s, to provide the necessary long-range missiles. But each time there's been this massive public debate, should we or shouldn't we, rather than actually standing up and looking Putin in the eye and saying, actually, we're going to support this democracy in Eastern Europe.
Tobias, let's talk about sanctions. And we're hearing the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has outlined fresh sanctions against Russia's energy sector today, as well as a £35 million of support to Ukraine to really repair its energy grid. We've seen that be devastated over the last few years. Tell us how both of these decisions will strengthen Ukraine's side.
Well, it's so important that we continue supporting Ukraine. Britain can't do it alone, but I'm pleased, as I was just outlining, how Britain has stepped forward, perhaps when other nations have hesitated, in providing that important support for Ukraine. We need to persuade our closest security ally, the United States, that European security is now at risk because of what Russia is actually doing. So I'm pleased to see that this government, this new government, is continuing where the previous government has gone, in providing that necessary support and standing up to Putin as well. But that reconstruction effort is so critical because far away from the front line, this is what Russia has been doing, actually attacking the critical national infrastructure to actually harm the Ukrainian people far away from the battle lines themselves. Again, breaching the Geneva Conventions, breaching the international norms of warfare, and yet we've done very, very little about it.
Tobias Ellwood, former British Defence Minister, thank you very much for your insights and for joining us.
Thank you.
To a developing story now, and it's reported that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is currently travelling to Cairo in order to reach a ceasefire agreement in Gaza. Sources say a deal could be signed within days. Let's go live to Tel Aviv now and speak to our correspondent Trent Murray. Trent, thanks so much for joining us. A spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister has denied the claims he was headed to Egypt. But what's been confirmed so far?
Yeah, Leigh Ann, that's right. We're tracking this very closely. This report was released by the Reuters news agency suggesting that a deal could be signed within days and that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was travelling to Cairo to join the talks. His office almost immediately came out and denied that was true, saying he was not in Cairo and he was not travelling to Cairo. They, in fact, released photos of him in Syria, believe it or not, on Mount Hermon, which is that tallest peak on the Israeli-Syrian border that the IDF claimed quite quickly after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. But certainly more broadly, on the ceasefire negotiations, there is speculation building that something is coming. We have heard from the US National Security Advisor John Kirby, who has spoken in the White House in the past few hours, saying that based on what the Israelis are telling Washington, a deal is getting closer and that there is some cautious optimism. But he also said, rightly, that we've been here before, we've been close and have just not managed to get it over the line. So right now, on that official story of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu travelling to Cairo, it is a firm denial. But at the same time, the briefings that are happening here in Israeli media from anonymous sources, politicians, is that the two sides are getting closer, and Hamas itself has released a statement saying that they are open to a deal if, in their view, Israel stops putting conditions in place.
Trent, so conflicting reports at the moment, but tell us why Egypt? What is their role in the mediation process?
Well, look, 438 days it has been since this war, and really since the beginning, Egypt has been a pretty important conduit between Israel and some of those Palestinian militant groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They have been able to host representatives from both sides, from the Israeli security establishment and from those Palestinian groups themselves. We also know Qatar has tried and has been involved in the negotiations, but it really has been Cairo where some of those previous ceasefire agreements have been able to be hatched and planned. We, of course, saw some of those hostages returned around 6 months after October 7th, but there's been no breakthrough since then. So undoubtedly, Cairo really is a focal point right now in all of this. We do know that leaders from Mossad and also Shin Bet, which are the two intelligence agencies in Israel, they have been in Cairo in recent days joining these talks. So look, all eyes are on this right now. As I say, over 100 hostages still being held by Hamas. The death toll, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, now over 45,000 in the Gaza Strip. And so for many in this region, there is a real hope that we could be getting close to bringing some form of ceasefire into play.
Trent Murray in Tel Aviv, thank you very much for joining us. Now, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is dealing with more pressure on his leadership as his ministers disagree on how to deal with the incoming US President Donald Trump's threat of 25% tariffs. The Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, has quit with a stinging condemnation of Trudeau's plans. She's already been replaced, but there is still no obvious solution to the dealings between Canada and the US, as Caroline Malone reports from Washington.
All smiles by the incoming Canadian Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc. But he knows there's a serious matter at hand. Only a month left until US President-elect Donald Trump comes into power, when he could enforce 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods. But unlike his predecessor, LeBlanc was on a recent trip to the US to visit Trump.
I was at the dinner at Mar-a-Lago 2.5 weeks ago and saw two leaders focused on a number of priorities, both in the Canada-US context, but talking about global issues as well.
It's not just Canada, but BRICS countries, including China, Europeans and others which could be impacted. Trump says he loves tariffs and has again insisted, as recently as Monday, that they will be good for the United States, as he says they were the last time he was president.
And we have all the cards. And until I came along, don't forget, and Howard was going over the numbers with me last night, we took in $600 billion and more in taxes and tariffs from China.
As we know it now.
There is also for Canada, though, the tricky issue of trying to deal with what Trump sees as a border issue. He's campaigned on a promise to crack down on illegal immigration and the flow of drugs, particularly fentanyl, from Mexico and Canada, with the threat of tariffs potentially a way to force them to act. But the US-Canada border is vast, and despite new barriers for vehicles, it is easier for people to walk through.
We're in charge of all of the border between Canada and US, with the notable exception of the designated point of entry, where it is the CBSA, the Canadian Border Service Agency, that has the mandate to man those posts.
Prime Minister Trudeau is considering increasing spending to boost border security. But there is still opposition to that idea. Some people think it will put Canada in a bad position to deal with economic hits from possible tariffs. While Ottawa's government reels, the US president-elect is piling it on. In one of Trump's latest social media posts, he joked that the great state of Canada is stunned as the finance minister resigns or was fired from her position by Governor Justin Trudeau. And while Canada is clearly not part of the United States, the US is its biggest trading partner, with goods exchanged worth more than $900 billion a year. And any hit from tariffs on those deals could be economically devastating. Caroline Malone, Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. 3 people, including a teenage suspect, have died after a school shooting in Wisconsin. The alleged shooter, a 15-year-old girl identified as Natalie Rutnow, is thought to have taken her own life after opening fire at a fellow student and a teacher at Abundant Life Christian School in the state's capital, Madison. 6 others were also injured. There have been 322 school shootings in the United States so far this year. A powerful earthquake with a magnitude of 7.4 has hit the South Pacific island of Vanuatu. The United Nations has reported a number of deaths and significant damage to 2 reservoirs and a hospital. Australia's foreign minister has deployed search and rescue teams as well as medical assistance. Carlos Watson, the founder of failed media and entertainment company Aussie Media, has been sentenced to nearly 10 years in prison for fraud. Prosecutors said the former NSNBC host and ex-Goldman Sachs banker had orchestrated a years-long scheme that resulted in tens of millions of dollars of losses for investors. Watson denies the allegations and says he plans to appeal the verdict. And Harry and Meghan have shared a rare photo of their 2 children on their official Christmas card. It is among a series of 6 photos on the festive card for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet can be seen in one of the photos facing away from the camera as they walk towards their parents, who greet them with smiles and also open arms. To the ongoing crisis in Syria now, and Turkey may be preparing for a military offensive against the Syrian Democratic Forces. Reports suggest military build-up is continuing along the border of SDF-held Kobani in the north of Syria. The moves follow the end of a US-mediated 4-day ceasefire between the Kurdish-led SDF and the Turkish-backed SNA. Let's speak to Vladimir van Wildenberg, journalist and co-author of 2 books on the Syrian Kurds. Vladimir, thank you so much for joining us. Is a Turkish offensive likely to happen in the coming hours or days? What's the mood or feeling on the ground?
Well, there were attempts by the United States to mediate between the Kurdish-backed forces and the Turkish-backed forces. But those attempts failed because the Kurds are saying that the Turks wanted to build a military base not very far from Kobani, and they didn't accept that. But until now, so today there were apparently already fighting between Turkish-backed groups and Kurdish-backed forces near the Tishrin Dam. So it seems that the conflict is increasing again after like 4 or 5 days of non-fighting.
Why is claiming and holding territory in Syria so important for the Kurds?
Well, I mean, the Kurds, since the start of the Syrian civil war, they have attempted to build like autonomous area. So they have like a large area in northern Syria, and also they have worked with the Americans against ISIS, especially since the fight of Kobani. But the Turkish government, they may not be very happy with this autonomous area, and they want this area to be under control of rebel forces. So as a result, now there's fighting now in the north, and most likely this will continue.
A US-backed ceasefire deal, as you said, has ended. But do you think there are ongoing background efforts to prevent an all-out conflict?
Yeah, the US, they are afraid that this could hinder the fight against ISIS. The Kurds in Syria have been the main ally for the US against ISIS in northern Syria. So they worry that the fighting and the operations against ISIS will be suspended because of this war. Also, the Kurds, they hold like around 50,000 people, ISIS families in camps in northern Syria, and also ISIS fighters. So they also worried if Turkey will attack attack the Kurds, that these people could run free. So they're afraid that those people could be released. So that's why there's now efforts by the US to stop the fighting. But it seems that there was some small fighting near the Tishrin Bridge, the Tishrin Dam.
And what does this mean for people who are living in the area?
Well, I mean, especially the people in the city of Kobani, I talked to them today, they are very afraid of such an offensive. because also there have been human rights abuses by Turkish-backed groups, and they are afraid that if those groups would attack the area, they could be displaced. But also, if these groups take over these areas, they could be prosecuted for their ties to the previous administration.
What are the Kurds eager to see from a new Syrian government in the coming weeks?
Well, the Kurds, they have been sending several signals that they are willing to talk with the new government led by Ahmed Shara Jolani. They want to have their security forces to be united under a Syrian roof, but they want to stay autonomous. So they still want to have a separate administration, but like a decentralized administration. So what they're basically asking for is like a decentralized Syria with autonomy for the Kurds. And they say that all options are open for talking with the new government in Damascus, but so far there have been no talks between the both sides.
Journalist and author Vladimir van Wildenberg, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Sticking with Syria, and the toppling of Bashar al-Assad has sent a jolt through the Syrian diaspora. Many never imagined the decades-old regime would ever be toppled, but their joy is being tempered by fear of what will happen next. Some are cautiously optimistic that this could be a turning point for the war-ravaged nation, but others worry about who will assume power and whether other countries will take advantage of this vulnerable moment for Syria. Tony Waterman has more from Texas.
It's the dancing that transports Zain al-Jundi home. With each mesmerizing movement, a story unfolds.
In the middle!
Her story begins in Syria, the genesis of her love of dance, art, and singing. The homeland she and her family fled 43 years ago as the Assad regime tightened its grip on power.
Before the Assad, my dad's side of the family was part of the government of Syria. And then my father's cousin was the head of the Secret Service at the time, and he was assassinated.
The surprise toppling of Bashar al-Assad has left her elated, she says, but also more frightened than she's been in years.
I don't want Syria divided. I don't want anyone to take part of it. I don't care if they are within Syria or from outside of Syria. I don't want Syria to be an Islamist country.
Israel, Turkey, and the U.S. have launched hundreds of airstrikes across the country, destroying military equipment and installations that they fear could fall into the wrong hands. But critics say it has left Syria less able to defend itself. The U.S. has also deployed top officials across the Middle East, keen to influence the future governance of Syria.
But with just 6 weeks left in office, it's unclear how much sway Biden's officials can really have. Attention is already turning to his replacement, Donald Trump, who has indicated he'll take a hands-off approach, saying that Syria is no friend to the U.S.
Some question whether Trump will once again try to pull the roughly 900 American troops stationed in the northeast out of Syria. Troops whose main priority is to fight ISIS, with the help of the U.S.-backed Syrian Defense Forces.
Of course, everyone is waiting for President-elect Trump to go back to the White House, and then we'll be able to know, will those forces withdraw from Syria, will they stay there, or will their mandate change?
It's a question on the minds of Syrians in America, too. Whether the country they now call home will help the homeland they still love.
I just want the fighting to end. I want the Syrian people to finally catch a break. They so deserve it.
Tony Waterman, Al Arabiya News, Austin, Texas.
Let's take a look at the top business news. President-elect Trump has met with the CEO of TikTok at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. The social media platform will be banned in America unless it's sold by Chinese parent corporation ByteDance by the 19th of January because of its alleged links to the Chinese state. Both TikTok and ByteDance deny the claims. India's gold imports are expected to slow this month following record sales in November. Gold imports more than doubled last month, reaching a record $14.8 billion. Analysts believe the drop could help India narrow its trade deficit and push up the rupee. Now turning to sports news. And legendary Brazilian striker Ronaldo has announced plans to run for the country's football association and recover the prestige of the national side. The 48-year-old goal scorer received 98 caps for his country during the course of his career and hopes to replace current CBF president Reinaldo Rodrigues. Brazil have won the World Cup a record-breaking 5 times, but have not reached further than the quarter-final since 2002. And Chelsea winger Mykhailo Mudryk is said to be in complete shock after testing positive for a banned substance. The FA contacted the West London club after discovering an adverse finding in a routine urine check. Mudryk has denied using a banned substance and says he hopes to be back on the pitch soon. And staying with sports now, and 2 of the most famous names in modern-day boxing, Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk, will reunite in the ring at the Kingdom Arena in Riyadh this Saturday. Ahead of the rematch, Al Arabiya's Riz Khan sat down with Fury and asked him his thoughts on the fight, a future clash with Anthony Joshua, and the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia.
Tyson, nice to get round 2 with you a few months on. Looking back on the fight from last time, did you underestimate Alexander Usyk, do you think?
No, I didn't. No, he got a decision over me. He won by 1 point. Very close fight. Good luck to the guy. We're going to run it back on Saturday, and it's going to be victory for me.
Fingers crossed. But the thing is, you now know each other's tactics pretty well.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that perhaps the fight will go in a similar way, similar style?
It might do, yeah. Well, it'll all play out on Saturday night how it plays out, really.
Now, I know both you and Alexander Usyk are Manchester United fans.
Are we?
So you might, well, apparently, yeah. So
I didn't know he was.
You must be both happy about the victory against the arch rivals Man City.
Yes, good little victory. Yeah. City are on a big losing streak at the moment.
But it also came at a time when Saudi got announced with the FIFA 2034 Cup.
Yes.
Now, knowing the country as you do, with the sports here, what do you expect from a Saudi World Cup?
I think it's going to be a fantastic World Cup. First of all, congratulations to Saudi on getting the FIFA World Cup 32. I think it'll be a fantastic event. Any sporting event that's held in Saudi is usually a marvellous event. So I'm sure the biggest sporting event on earth, the FIFA World Cup, will be even bigger.
Now, it's true because when you look at boxing along with football, UFC, tennis, Formula One, and Live Golf, for example, it's transforming the Saudi scene. And what's it like for you to have played quite a major role in that kind of transformation?
It's been fantastic. It's been a fantastic opportunity for me to come here and showcase over in Saudi Arabia and also get the biggest fights that's possible on earth.
Well, so many of the great popular dramas of our time, from The Godfather to The Matrix, The Lord of the Rings, have been trilogies. Even your own famous trilogy versus Daytona Wilder. Now, His Excellency Turki al-Sheikh recently said he wants you to do the job in the rematch to pave the way for the Furious trilogy next year. What do you think? Will that trilogy happen?
I think it's going to happen, yes. I think it'll happen. When I win on Saturday night, I think there's got to be a trilogy next year for sure.
Now, there are fans, millions of fans who'd love to see you, still eager to see you fight Anthony Joshua. You famously said Joshua's losing to Dubois cost you £150 million in lost revenue for your super fight against him. What would the trilogy take precedence over a Fury versus Joshua?
For sure. Fight? Joshua's in tatters at the moment. He's got to pick up the pieces from his last fight. But the fight with Usyk, again, the one on Saturday and then one afterwards will be fantastic for me.
Now, Mike Tyson has thrown his support behind you in your fight with Usyk. And we just saw him step into the ring and lose to the YouTube megastar Jake Paul last month. What did you make of that bout? And just out of curiosity, would we ever expect to see you fight Jake Paul when you're 58 maybe?
No, definitely not. Not for me at 58. Mike's an awesome guy, and to get back in the ring at 58 takes a lot of guts. He needs to be respected for that. And, it was big for boxing, one of the biggest fights that boxing's ever seen with Jake and Mike. And I thought it was fantastic. Obviously Mike didn't get the result, but it was good for Mike, good for Mike's pocket, and good for Jake's pocket too. So fantastic for boxing.
When I asked you last time, would you step into the ring at around 60? You said, if the price is right.
Always. I'm a prize fighter.
Okay. Now it's coming. This bout's coming around near the Christmas time, the Christmas season for a lot of people in the Western world, especially. And I wonder what the Fury household is like around this time of the year.
Mayhem. There's a lot of sweets and chocolates and cooking going on. A lot of action.
You know, last time we spoke, we had the chance to do this 12 quick fire questions, where I asked you about competitions, who would win against who. This time, let's do an interesting one if we can. Okay. We do like 10 rounds of names, which, when I say the name, if you can, give me a one-word description for that name.
Yep.
You want to try that? So, Alexander Usyk.
The cat.
Okay.
Rabbit.
3 words.
Just one then, rabbit.
Anthony Joshua.
Sausage.
All right. Eddie Hearn.
Fast.
Okay. I won't ask you to explain these just yet, but anyway, Turkey El-Sheikh.
Excellent.
Okay. Donald Trump.
President.
Elon Musk.
Genius.
Muhammad Ali.
The greatest. Well, that's 2.
Mike Tyson.
Legend.
Okay, and then your dad, John Fury.
Papa.
Be careful with this last one. Your wife, Paris.
A witch.
We'll have to cut that one, I think.
That'd be all right.
Tyson Fury, thank you so
very
much. Really, what a pleasure.
All the best. Thanks
Always.
again.
Thank you, sir.
All the best.
A reminder of our top stories. Ukrainian intelligence claim responsibility for killing senior Russian General Igor Kirillo and his assistant in Moscow. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is reportedly travelling to Cairo with the Gaza ceasefire deal expected to be reached within days. Turkey and its Syrian proxies may be preparing for an incursion into areas held by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. And time with Tyson. The former world heavyweight champion Tyson Fury tells Al Arabiya's Riz Khan why he's looking forward to the World Cup in Saudi Arabia as he prepares for Saturday's rematch with Alexander Usyk in Riyadh. And that's all for us on W News. Thanks for joining us, Riz Khan. He's coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
In 2018, Maria Butina was convicted of working as an unregistered Russian foreign agent in the US. She was jailed and then deported to Russia. Butina has always denied being a Russian spy, and at the time, President Vladimir Putin said he had never heard of her. Well, she now serves as a parliamentarian in the Russian State Duma and is a supporter of the Russian military offensive in Ukraine. Maria Butina, good to have you on the show. Let's start with the latest developments in Ukraine. Following the recent round of escalation and the warnings issued by President Putin, do you fear the world is now closer to nuclear war than at any other point in your lifetime?
Well, I don't know, because I haven't been in other points of our world's life, like the Cuban Missile Crisis or Caribbean Missile Crisis, depends, where you live and how you call it. But I think we are now in a quite low point of the relationships between Russia and the West, and that's put the whole world in the danger.
You know, the numbers of casualties are difficult to calculate, and they're disputed by both sides. But after the 1,000-day milestone was passed, how are the Russian people managing to accept the losses of their sons, and do they clearly know what the sacrifice is for?
They absolutely do. And I was elected from a small region, Kirovska Oblast, which is located in about 1.5 hour flight from Moscow. And I should tell you that we are all united and we help to the front lines, and we cry for those who are, lost their lives, sacrificing them for our motherland. But we all understand that this is a necessary thing to do, because we are trying to help to the Russians in their new territories, Russian new territories, that's first. And the second, which I view very, very important, we actually are fighting for survival of Russia and the whole world, because we see that Nazism in a full scale is back, and we have to stop it. We absolutely have to stop it.
There are arguments put forward, though, that the Russian people don't necessarily know the full story because of the control of the media there. How can Russian people make a clear decision if they don't have a full idea of what's going on?
Oh, come on, they have quite a full idea what's going on, because, you can go on Telegram channels and you read a lot of stuff from both sides, and people understand what's going on. And even if little villages, people don't rely on TV anymore that much. Only 50% of Russian population is TV watchers. Most of them actually go on social networking and they talk to each other. And you cannot hide the truth. And the truth is that SMO should have been started, because NATO was coming so close to our borders that it would put the whole world in the actual stance of the Third World War. So we were protecting Russian-speaking population, and we absolutely understand how important it is to make a step forward today. So people do know the truth and they see the truth. And people who come back from the front lines and they're on their vacation, they tell the truth, that how horrible actions are committed by what horrible crimes are committed by the Ukrainian forces that are joined by the NATO forces. Well, we didn't place NATO next to our borders. NATO placed themselves, and they broke their promises. Well, all Russians know it. So we're kind of, smart and intellectual to be able to find out what is true and what is not. And people do it and manage it very well.
And of course, there are accusations from both sides about abuses on the battlefield. But as the new administration comes into the U.S., eyes are turning towards a peace deal. I want to get your perspective on what you regard as a fair peace deal to end the war.
I don't know. Look, first of all, I don't know if the U.S. administration, the new one, is actually credible in terms of what they say and what they do. Because the last time when Trump came to power, I was living in the United States those days, and then they made me to serve prison time for actually peace building in the US, and Trump was in charge. So he was promising to make good relationships with Russia, but in fact, we had more sanctions and more diplomats expelled, and people were more and more distant, removed from each other. I mean, the US people and the Russians that had ever been. So they say they want to stop the conflict. Do they really want to do so? I don't know. And for right now, I do believe that the US is way more focused on the Israel-Palestinian situation than on Ukraine and Russia, because they clearly understand by now that Russia is going to win. There is no options. And the people, they know the truth, and they're going to, fight until the last breath. I mean, the Russians. And Ukraine will lose. There is no other way. And additionally to that, now there are so many people fleeing the West, moving to Russia, that you have to be blind not to see that not just the war on the war field is lost by the West, but they also lost the war for the minds and souls of people if they're moving to Russia. Well, I know I handle this program in the Russian parliament, and I can see every single day more and more people coming with families. They just hate LGBT stuff, and they want to leave and raise their families and kids in a peaceful community that which they view Russia. So we struggle now how to get so many people in, because they come and there are a lot of them, and they're investors and they have money and do all this stuff. So it's quite surprising for me. But it means the West lost the battle for the souls and for the hearts of the people as well.
Well, the report of there haven't been many reports in terms of people moving to Russia on the western side. Perhaps that wouldn't be surprising. But either way, both Presidents Putin and Trump are regarded as tough negotiators. Who do you regard as the stronger of the two? And Do you expect any compromise from President Putin on his objectives?
I expect not a compromise, but I expect a consensus. I mean, I expect both sides to focus on what is profitable for each side, but not on the losses and compromises of which one. And I do believe that this is the only way how to negotiate. Well, first, number one thing that the US should do, they just take their selves out of Europe, because that's not their land. That's not their decision. That's not their solution. There is not their land. They have to get out and let people, Europeans, to decide themselves how they want to live, because they now press every single country in Europe, all the countries, to just, follow their will, but they shall not have any power here. There is no reason. And they're just, flooding Europe with their money and trying to buy politicians. That's what, in fact, they do. And that's not the peaceful negotiations. Whom to negotiate with? European countries, including Ukraine now, they lost their sovereignty. They cannot just freely talk anymore, which means that if you want a peaceful, a good deal, the US should step back and realize that this is not their land.
Let me get your perspective, Ms. Butina, on how life has changed for ordinary people in Russia since the war began. How have the economic sanctions been felt? What impact are they having?
Well, we have full grocery stores. We don't have any problems central heating. We don't have any skyrocket prices. We're actually fine. The main thing that changed, and this is absolutely true, that we're all now stand together side by side, because any time when in Russia some external force is trying to push us, we become more and more united. That's what happened. So now I see a lot of patriotism in Russia, because we know that we have to be close to each other to stand against NATO. Like, that's not a secret anymore. There is no just Ukraine. This is now NATO fighting by Ukrainian lives. That's how it's called, which means that Russians do understand, and they stand side by side. And now we are welcoming new foreigners who come, join us and help us. This is what's going on. This is the average mood in Russia. Yes, the hardships, but we used to live in the hardships. Look, they had it during their Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. And yeah, we know how to sorrow, but on the other hand, this is how we used to live. So by external pressure, you cannot conquer Russia. Our empire has been lost for the last ages and ages, and will stand ages to come. It's one of the longest standing empires in the world, multinational. So we're going to be okay. Hard times, but it will make us stronger.
Well, so presumably the reports of increased inflation must be having an impact on the day-to-day lives, and will start to test the will of the Russian people.
I don't think so. We have challenges on our will every single day, and because of the living and the weather conditions. So we're kind of used to go through hardships. But talking of inflation, yeah, there are hard times. People understand that, and they just work hard. And actually sanctions open new opportunities for us, because the companies that used to be very small now became big, because now we don't have Western products, and they have to take the market, and they love to take the market share. And we have a lot of partners in the BRICS countries that help us, and they want to trade, and we explore new brands. So we don't suffer at all. Meaning that it's not just the US who produces all the things. It's not just Europe. Europe needs Russia because of the gas and and oil and all this stuff. Russia has all the resources in the world. Why would we suffer?
Ms. Butina, I'm just looking at your past, and you lived in America for a while. Of course, it was a difficult time for you. You're accused of being a Russian operative and so on. But are you personally surprised or even saddened by the state of relations between Russia and America? And how do you think the ordinary people in both countries reflect the views of the leadership?
I am sad, because when I came to the States, I expected the American dream to be like we saw in the Hollywood movies in the 70s and the 80s. I expected conservative America, and I expected people who just, have one wonderful yard and they have wonderful families, and America has none of that. Like, not anymore. It's just they lost the country. And now all of that I see here in Russia. And it's just, the world is upside down indeed. Do I think that people actually share the views of the US government? Well, I don't know, because I see so many people moving from the States, and they hate the government. Well, and they don't like Russia maybe necessarily, but they don't hate us because people are people. And I used to actually serve time for having friendship dinners that were paid, by the way, by Americans. And like, I don't know why I became a Russian agent then, but anyway. So, and the friendship dinners just showed that people want to talk. That's why I support now the civil diplomacy. Well, I did serve time for civil diplomacy, but I was and I am a peace builder, and I will do it in the future because I believe, and you're absolutely right, if people talk to each other, they don't hate each other, and this is the only way how we can never ever have the Third World War, because that's my great hope. I don't want any serious conflict between Russia and NATO, because the whole world will suffer.
Well, you obviously must have made friends during that time in America. As you said, you had dinners with them and so on. In spite of your conviction as an unregistered operative in the country, do you have any particular regrets, and are you still in touch with any of those people?
Yeah, actually, yes. Some of them incognito, but they come here to Russia. It's very sad that we cannot communicate so much because they're afraid of the US government, that they're going to reach them and, cut them and throw them in prison because I'm under sanctions. And so I don't want to put them in danger as well. But they do travel here because this is friendship. Friendship is eternal. Love is eternal. These are the values that the US lost, but there are still people who are like this. And no, I do not hate the United States. I do not hate Americans, because if I do, it means that the bad guys win. So I don't want them to win. That's why I stay faithful. I believe in God. I am conservative, and I will fight for peace until my last breath.
Let me ask you, you, as in the conversation, you always denied being a Russian spy. So what do you think was the reason the justice system there pursued the case and put you in jail? Was it bureaucracy, do you think, or do you think there was a political reason behind it?
I was never accused of being a spy, okay? That's in the first place. Never. It was in the media. It had never been in my conviction, had never been even filed as a paper. And they needed a scapegoat. They needed someone physically to actually arrest at the day when Trump and Putin met. Look at the day of my arrest. Do you think it's a coincidence? They arrested me exactly when President Putin and President Trump were first time to meet, sit in front of each other, and they have this very, very loud case. Because somebody in the US, they don't want peace. They want war because they earn on wars. The private military companies are earning a lot of having wars all over the globe. Question is to us, to Russia, to Europeans, Arabs, Chinese, and all other countries. How long are we gonna let them do that? Are earning money on our life losses? I don't think that's smart. So they needed a scapegoat, they got a scapegoat. And look, if they would have even one piece of evidence that I am a spy, would they let me go in 18 months? No way. I would serve 35 years now, but there was nothing on me. Absolutely nothing. That's why they just wanted the public case and just throw me out of the country, claim I'm the national security threat. Yeah, you can see I'm very much a threat. And then just, make it. And they're still having fun on my case, saying like, oh, look, if she met someone, that means she, had relationships. They never ever shown one picture. And as a woman, I'm deeply insulted by that, because they were claiming all this relationship with someone. There is no one picture being made. Isn't it suspicious? Well, because it had never happened. This is a fictitious, fake case. This is how Trump says this is fake news.
Well, either way, they put you in prison. Didn't that change your view of the United States at all?
No, because people are people, and corrupted guys in the government are corrupted guys in the government. And, one thing has changed in me after prison and during my prison time. I spent 4 months on solitary confinement, which is against all the conventions against tortures, but don't forget about it. I found God, or God found me, I don't know. But I know one thing, that I shall not hate, and I do not hate. I forgive them. It doesn't mean I should forget, but I forgive them. So, and the bad guys, they will pay their price, because you know what? God is just. This is what I believe. I don't need to do any revenge on them. No, that's not my job. God will do everything. And all the people who acted badly, they will get their punishment no matter what. Even if we do nothing and just sitting and watching that, the justice is going to get.
So if you have moved on, but, you know, don't you really want to clear your name officially in the US?
I actually tried. I filed an appeal case, but the problem is that when you're sentenced in the U.S., you lose your right to appeal because you sign a special paper. Oh, they don't sentence you ever. That's the law. That you cannot appeal and you don't want to appeal, which is maybe sad. And I was very excited when Duran's report got out because there is nothing on me there, because that was the case that they actually based my conviction off, meaning the money that supposedly went from Kremlin to Trump. And then look at the Duran report, there was no money. The question is, why did I serve my time? So would I try to prove that I'm not guilty in the US court now? No, because it's corrupted. It does not make sense. I'll just lose money. In the future, maybe. Well, yes, it's insulting that my name was placed in dirt, because I'm from a family, a very distinguished family of teachers, and I'm a teacher by myself. I've always been a peace builder, and I teach kids. And now kids look at me saying like, oh, this is a, whatever they call her, a Russian honeypot. I've never been. And this is an insult. But there will be a day. I know there will be a day. And the history will place everything on its deserving spots.
Well, of course, when you were deported from America to Russia, in the American eyes, you were seen as a spy. I'm curious, how were you regarded in Russia? I know Vladimir Putin said he'd never heard of you at the time.
No, well, he mentioned my name a couple of times, but why should he? Meaning, I was just a student. That's the thing. I was just a student. Yes, my country fought for me because I'm a Russian citizen, and now I am having this parliament position of fighting for those who are oppressed and are in the prisons because they are Russians. There are a lot of them. And every single person here will stand for a Russian because, we know that tomorrow you will be at this spot. And, well, I do my job here. I'm a lawmaker. I help to people who move into Russia from the West. That's my responsibility today, and I'm very excited to do so. I do have a lot of work. No weekend, no vacation, not because I'm suffering, but because I love my job. That's why. Because I love helping people. I used to be a peacemaker. I love helping people. That's what I do today. I help people in prison. And they put me on solitary again for that. I don't care. I know what I do, and I do it for God. And people will do no harm for me because God is with me. Who are people if God is with me?
Yeah, I was wondering about your visit to the Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny in jail when he was on hunger strike. Why did you do that, and what did he say to you?
He was complaining that he has so bad conditions, so I wanted to check. And I went there, and I saw that he's lying. And I said straight to his eyes, and unfortunately, he didn't grant the permission to show the footage of what he was talking to me. He called me, well, I won't pronounce it because I'm a woman and I don't want this to be, public again, but he called me very bad words that is, I think, inappropriate from man to say to a woman, and it's unproven. He just repeated the US claims. It was insulting, but anyway, that was not my goal. I told the cameras and the camera crew from the very beginning, because look, I almost died. I went through tortures. I know what tortures are. And if I see just a sign that he's like that, I would stop it, because I would never let my country do what they did with me in the US. I lost my health. I lost my reputation, everything for doing nothing. So when I went there, I just wanted to ask how he's doing. And if he needs any help, I do help people to prisons all the time, but he was just fine. He was just cursing me out and just wanted to have, PRI and everything. And I don't know why he did it. I don't know, because I am happy to help. And it doesn't matter if you're an accuser of me, if you're, my former FBI agent, I will always help. That's my nature. And it was so horrible and painful that he was just, I don't know why he did so. I mean, I can see some of his mind.
Based on what you just said, Ms. Butina, considering his reaction to you and you were surprised by his very negative behavior with you, first of all, were you surprised when he died in prison? And secondly, having found religion, did you pray for him? Because religion involves forgiveness.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Every single moment. And actually, when he got sick first time after that plane flight, that was, and God will judge me if I'm lying here. Because the first thing there was a COVID time, and I remember it was in my apartment, and I was praying hard, so he gets through it, and God gave him another chance, and he went through it. And the second time, the same. I will pray especially for people who hate me, especially for people who curse me out, because I am a Jesus Christ believer. That's it. You can change it. Well, you can't explain it for a person who is non-believer. But absolutely, yes. And again, if his wife tomorrow shows up and she needs my help, I will help. If tomorrow people who curse me out and, place me in prison, throw me on solitary, are going to pray for my help, I will pray for them and I will help because God says me to do so. It's in the Bible. I will follow the Bible because I know that this life now is nothing comparatively to what is ahead. So I it's hard to explain the ways. It's just, it is. I'm helping now here. We have a group of traditional Catholics that were, in the US called domestic terrorists in the FBI node, and many of them now moved to Russia. I am a Russian Orthodox. Why would I help them to establish here a church? They are legal now, they're registered, it's all okay. They have a little chapel now, but I want for them better conditions. Not Catholic, why shall I do so? Because I'm Christian. Right? Well, so, help to a Muslim, to a Christian, to anyone who needs help.
On that note, I wanted to touch a bit on your work as a politician in Russia now, and you've touched on this issue of helping people to resettle from the West into Russia. I'd indicated earlier it's not something widely reported in the media in the West, but how important is that as a project for you, and what's your real motivation for doing it?
Well, my real motivation is to help people because nothing makes me more happy. Well, you can call me selfish and egoistic, but that's what gives me joy. Helping others. When I see all these families setting up and having their houses and having jobs and their kids, step by step learning Russian language and, telling me stories about their own culture. I have this wonderful, fantastic family of Joseph Schutzman. He's an American who moved to Russia recently. He has seven kids and 3 girls. And these 3 girls asked me to translate Russian fairy tales into English. Well, I'm not great in translating fairy tales, but it's so charming. So for me, the motivation it's just the soul. Well, I don't know if my soul is pure because I'm the worst sinner you could imagine. Well, because I have to confess all the time because I misstep all the time. But I just have joy when people smile and people have their lives and families and they live as conservatives, and it's wonderful. Yeah, we have this program, and actually we just established a group called Welcome to Russia, and I serve on the board. We also have people there with dual citizenship from Germany and France and Australia and Austria. And so those are now Russian citizens. They serve on the board with me because we hold hands. We're holding hands to help to those who are looking for the Salvation Ark. And the Salvation Ark today for conservatives is Russia, and the word gets out. So we have many applications from those people.
Well, let me ask you, Ms. Butina, do you think more people will move if there is a peace deal?
I don't think it's related. Well, the number one reason why people come here is because they believe in God, they're conservatives, and they hate and they do not accept LGBT agenda. Well, if the US will come back being a conservative state and they stop the LGBT propaganda, then maybe people just, always prefer to keep their homes. But you should understand they come not because they want to. They come out of necessity because they know that their kids are trained now and against your will as parents to become LGBT, so you lose your future. So people come here not because they necessarily love Russia, but because they're looking for a safe place where they actually survive and they keep their culture and ancestries until their world and the times to come. That's why. So I don't think it's related to Ukraine or Russia or any military zone. It's more related to their hearts and souls.
It's an interesting point you raise about the LGBT community. What's the situation for those already in Russia? What's their current prospect?
Well, the LGBT in Russia is banned. And absolutely, the whole movement cannot propagate. You cannot go on the streets and do parades and we are very proud of that. We are very proud that we have God in our constitution. We are very proud that we have mother and father in our constitution because we don't take any other gender because God created us this way. And yes, Russia is a conservative state today. And yes, LGBT is not welcome here. Okay? I think that's fine. We don't put people on a treatment or something, but okay, whatever you believe, but you have not bring it to the kids at schools, not on the streets. You cannot do propaganda of LGBT, and you cannot have any official or unofficial movements of LGBT community. Okay, that's just our country. We're a sovereign country. That's what we decided. This is the path we decided for ourselves.
Well, Maria Butina, I thank you very much for making the time to join the show.
Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Just days after America's chaotic and deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan, a daring film crew embedded themselves with the Taliban, capturing a story the world has never seen before. Over the course of the year, they documented the shocking realities of a group totally unprepared for power, but wielding billions of dollars in abandoned U.S. military hardware.
Odessa Ray, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you what brought you to this project.
In those first days after the U.S. pullout, they were quite euphoric and sort of willing to give access, willing to give interviews. They sort of were presenting themselves as this Taliban 2.0, you know, different from the previous Taliban, and within that package, willing to sort of do interviews. And that was the window that Ibrahim went in with. And keeping that access over 1 year was much harder than actually getting it in the first place. And even though getting it, we got it with the lower level Mukhtar, the second character, and sort of worked his way up to the big boss.
I noticed this sort of tendency throughout the film for these guys constantly to be looking over their shoulder, in the sense they were always fearful of being infiltrated. And no doubt this was something that they feared as well.
For sure. Yeah. For sure. Especially, I think, the longer he stayed, because they just, you know, it's like they even explain in the film, they're like, well, what's he doing? He's making a documentary. It's like a movie, but with real people, you know? And I think that, but what's interesting about that is he had one person with him, his translator, Adele, who was really trusted, and he was like the only person that was with Ibrahim really this whole time. And the first time that there was this kind of threat voice towards Ibrahim while he was filming, Adele translated it, and he said to Adele, "Don't ever translate that stuff to me again." And he didn't. He really listened to that. And when we got into the edit and we started translating all the material, Ibrahim himself was surprised in these moments. Like, he'd send me screenshots from the translation team, just like, "Oh my God, look at this." You know, and that was sort of when that whole side of it started to become more apparent
and more real to him, no doubt.
Yeah.
By keeping it for later,
yeah,
he was probably able to focus more.
Yeah. And keep going back, because he took breaks. He would go for like a certain period, 6 to 8 weeks or something, until you could feel like they were just tired of him, you know?
Yeah.
And then he would leave, and he would sort of wait until, you know, give them a moment, and then start approach again, like, can I come back? I really need to film this, da, da, da. And he would go back again. And each time going back, I think he was just quite nervous about everything.
Taking a bigger risk.
Taking a bigger risk, yeah.
So to do what's been done in Hollywood Gate, to take those risks as a filmmaker, that's something that is difficult for other people to get their head around. Why in the world would you risk your life to go be with people that, as you say, the world has a very, very negative perception of? Why was this important? And frankly, does he fear for his life?
Well, I think Ibrahim, deep down inside, does have some kind of fear for the risk that he's taken and the position that it puts him in now, also being a spokesperson for this film.
Yeah.
But he would never admit it, because he felt and feels so deeply for the pain that the Afghan people are going through.
Yeah. And you see multiple times in the film where they're questioning why he's there. You know, there's one statement about if he doesn't do what he says he's going to do and keep his word in terms of representing us, we'll kill him.
Yeah. Which actually he didn't know fully, because he told his translator, who was with him the whole time, after the first threat came through, he was like, don't translate that stuff for me. And Adele actually listened, and so those things were discovered in the edit later, and he'd be sending me screenshots saying, oh my God, look what they're saying, you know? So he wasn't fully aware, but he definitely felt it. He wasn't ignorant to it. Yeah. And the last day, the parade that we shot, that was the last thing we shot, because it was very clear to him that that was dangerous. Yes, exactly. Because we had sort of been filming within one section of the leadership, but on that day, all the leadership was there. And Ibrahim was the only person on that stage with a camera. Yeah. And so other parts of the leadership, I think the head of security, et cetera, they noticed him, and they were like, wait, who are you and what are you doing here? Yes. And you're coming with us. And he actually ran away from that after the parade, went straight to Kabul airport and caught the first plane out, and that was the last time that he was there. Yeah. And the burner phones that we had with the subjects, he deleted them and, you know, stopped those accounts after a few weeks of leaving.
The very idea of going in to a place like Afghanistan, where the U.S. has just, you know, made this disastrous withdrawal, putting your feet on the ground when you know that your life will be at risk in every moment, most people would say, he must be crazy.
I know.
Is Ibrahim crazy?
No, he's just a deeply empathetic person. He grew up in Egypt. Yeah. He grew up, you know, also observing. He also was a journalist before at Al Jazeera. Yes. And when he was a journalist, he worked in a TV show where they interviewed prominent leaders in the Middle East, etc. And he observed, you know, groups like the Taliban throughout his years growing up in journalism, and how people sort of revered them. And he always questioned this sort of praise of these kind of groups. And he knew that when they were coming back into power, that it meant devastation for the Afghan people. And I think he just felt deeply compelled to not allow that to be forgotten. And
to tell that story.
Yes, exactly, and tell that story. And he, honestly, he just, he really didn't think of the
danger.
The danger, and also the psychological toll that it takes on you, because we had to get him therapy, like in between. Yes. And this was really helpful, because it's very difficult to sort of be within an ideology all day long that you don't agree with and not be able to say anything.
To lose your voice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he, early on, there's one story that he told recently that I only heard recently from him, that in the early days, there was one younger Talib who seemed really intelligent, you know, and he sort of had a dialogue with him, and he was like, you seem so intelligent. Like, why are you in this? Why are you doing, like, you could
Yes.
get a degree, you could be an engineer, you could go and like do something with your life. And that young Talib went to his commander and was like, you know what, I don't want to do this. I want to go and be an engineer, and I have other dreams maybe for myself. And the commander was like, where did you get these ideas?
Wow.
And he said, well, that cameraman. And he was called here and he said, you ever say something like that again, like, you're dead, you know?
Wow.
And so that he then kept his mouth shut. He understood that saying anything to anyone was going to endanger him.
Yeah.
And he kept his mouth shut, and he kept his camera rolling. And he kept his camera rolling, you know, there's so much that we had to shoot to sort of just appease them.
No doubt.
You know? Like all their propaganda ideas, right? Because this film's very much about how they think they're going to use,
how they want to be
learn
perceived.
from Hollywood, which
Yes.
is part of the title, even though it's on the gate, about propaganda. Oh, okay, now maybe we should start to create propaganda.
Yes.
And they're even learning that to use on their own people now, right? This narrative of, oh, the West is this, the infidels, the whatever, right? Propaganda is such a powerful tool
Yes.
in the mechanisms of creating war and control, right?
Yes.
Controlling society. And we had to shoot, so he was always watched and controlled what he would shoot, right? And the bits that we made the film with were like the bits in between when they forgot, because he spent so many hours there. And he would sit in rooms just holding the camera on them so they'd forget about the camera.
Yes.
And it wouldn't even be on because he knew he was shooting stuff that he's not going to use for hours and hours. And forget about the camera, they forget they're mic'd up, and then click, you know, start rolling.
That's the moment.
And like, yeah. And the film was built through those in-between moments.
Yeah. It's fascinating the idea of that bird's eye view in
Yeah.
those very first days, because it was very clear that they, as the Taliban, you know, had stumbled into a victory that they never anticipated.
Yeah.
And you really see, I mean, as someone who covered the departure from Afghanistan, at least from a journalist's perspective, what it must have been really like for them walking into those buildings and seeing the mess that the coalition forces had left behind. And even they were surprised. How could they have left all of this here?
Yeah, right?
Like total surprise.
No, and even a friend of mine who's incredibly intelligent, when she watched the film, she was like, honestly, I don't even look at it as like the Taliban and this and it. It's like one sort of foreign group, almost anthropological study of like what happens to a certain culture when they come in contact with another culture, right? Because they start to pick up these things and these objects, and they see all these objects, and you can see when they are walking out of the caves, they say, well, if we had all this stuff, we would rule the world, right? So
Yes.
it's how these things start to infuse them also with ideas and change the way they think even, right?
Yeah.
And then they fix the weapons and what they, you know, how they end up with like calling the Tajikistan and threatening them.
I found it very interesting as well. I mean, walking into that hangar, the shots of the planes.
Right.
For me, this just sort of in every way symbolized, frankly, what America, sadly, has become in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And it was hearkening back to the days of Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. And we heard that analogy made time and time again. In your mind, what does this film mean in terms of a broader representation of what's happened over the last several years? Because if you look at the fall of Afghanistan, this disastrous departure, and then 4 years on, we have multiple wars, a deeply destabilized Middle East, even right now what's happening in Syria. And many would say that this is a direct result of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, that this started a chain reaction. Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. Israel would not be doing what it's doing in Gaza, et cetera. And that may be a false assertion, but certainly to those who've watched the region as I have, and you have for decades, it feels as if that was the beginning.
Yeah. War begets war begets war.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is it ever the solution? I mean, obviously we look at that and we question this war machine, right? You have to question, is that the way to do it? Because no, we set these weird, unreachable goals, right? It started in Afghanistan as we're going after bin Laden, and then it became
nation building,
freedom, democracy. Look at Iraq. Like, it's not working.
Yeah.
We have to obviously come up with a different way forward.
Yeah. When you think about sort of, you picked Hollywood Gate, you also obviously did Navalny. What do these types of films mean to you?
The truth, you know? I think it's really important in film. What can you see through a film? 90 minutes with Alexei Navalny, I feel like, will give you so much more understanding of him as a human being than whatever you read in the news, you know, 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. It's like you lived with him. You felt his sincerity, right?
Yes.
Watching what we left behind, Afghanistan now, just the destruction and the people that are suffering there. You know,
it's incredible.
It's like the Western media would love us to just forget and they don't focus on it anymore.
Exactly.
And that's what hopefully this film will get people to do, is just look at it. We don't just move on from Iraq. We don't just move on from Afghanistan. Afghanistan's still there. Iraq is still there. It has Syria.
Yeah.
You know?
These are the messes we've left behind.
Exactly.
I've challenged several world leaders, most recently the First Lady of Pakistan, about Afghans women and the situation in which they find themselves consistently rolling back every freedom. And the narrative that we see is that we gave them great promise for 20 years and then we utterly abandoned them.
I mean, it's horrific. Women right now, like, you know, the laws that were passed recently, they cannot speak outside of their own home. They can't go to a park with their child.
Yeah.
They can't go grocery shop. Like, they have to be, you know, supervised by a man. And still at the grocery store, I was speaking to an Afghan refugee recently whose wife is still in Kabul. I was like, so if she needs to go to the grocery store, how does that work? You know, he says, my brother or my uncle or someone comes over and takes her to the store. But still, even at the store, she can't speak. So she wants tomatoes. It's like, like trying to gesture. Can you imagine a woman, like even in a grocery store, which is, I mean.
They're erasing women.
It's completely, you can't sit like on the outside of your house and face the sun, right? You can't sing even inside your own house because your voice might carry. You can't read aloud inside your own house certain things. You can't have conversations with other women about certain topics. Like, those women are in prison.
One of the characters in the film, one of the people in the film, has basically said to his wife, you can't be a doctor anymore. You have to stay home. You have to follow Sharia. And this caused quite a bit of a conversation because the implementation of Taliban 2.0 was still in those early days up for debate.
Right. And can you imagine, had he let his wife be a doctor and maybe come to that base with him when they discover all those medicines that are left behind by our army, right? And what she would have maybe seen in those medicines and been able to implement it and at least get it into society before they all expired for the general population. Obviously, they don't care about the general population because those sat there expiring and his wife sat at home cooking.
When you think about your subjects, the way you choose to get involved in films, what is the one sort of similarity that they all have?
Fighting for the truth to be seen.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's something that just drives me. You know, it's like you're dealing with situations that are so sensitive, people that are holding a lot, politically sensitive, emotionally, you know. And when you are a documentarian, you have to sort of embed in those situations. You become very close to the subjects, right? I lived in the Black Forest with Alexei Navalny and Yulia, etc., for months, and was there the last day that we put him on the plane back to Russia, you know, and carrying Ibrahim through Hollywood Gate. It's you become very close, right? And yet you have to sort of make sure that you still keep a distance enough to make an objective film.
Yeah.
Which is challenging.
No doubt. I mean, you go into these situations perhaps with the preconceived notion of what it is you want to do or what you expect to see, and that, I assume, gets blown up pretty quickly.
I go into situations where we don't have an idea, and those are the situations that excite me. That just like, let's follow it. You know, like when we went in to meet Alexei Navalny, we didn't know they were going to make this phone call to Kudratsev. We didn't know he was going to go back. We just knew he'd been poisoned, and he was sitting, and he had just come out of a coma, and what was happening to this interesting figure, you know? So I feel like I'm sort of drawn to the person, because I know the person is going to walk an interesting path.
Yes.
And let's see where that path goes. So even the film I shot in Ukraine during the war, I was covering negotiations between Russia, Ukraine at first, but then those fell apart very quickly, and it became negotiations for weapons, negotiations with foreign nations, diplomacy. So I was very close to Kuleba while he was foreign minister, Rustem Umerov, who became the Minister of Defense. And I had no idea every day sort of where that story would go, you know?
Yeah. When you were shooting with Alexei Navalny, did you have a sense then that he was getting on a plane to his death?
No, absolutely not. And I don't know. He's such an optimistic person that he knew he was heading into potentially a grave challenge. But at the same time, I think 50% of him hoped that everything would be fine, you know? I think that he even hoped that upon immediate return, he would potentially not even go to prison, you know, because truth was on his side. And Navalny was someone that believed in the truth. And the trials that he was facing at that time were these sham trials. And then they sort of put him in prison for a small period of time. And then they started implementing all these new laws around extremism, around terrorism, right? They retroactively labeled his organization a terrorist organization and then tried him for that. That wasn't even existing when he was leaving. And the war hadn't started yet. So he sort of we didn't really fully know how far Putin was willing to go.
In hindsight, it's easier to say, oh, he was naive.
Right.
But you don't see it that way.
No. I think that when you are someone like Navalny who, you know, commits to fighting for that kind of path, for the future of the country the dream that you hold for that country, you have to be an optimistic person.
Yeah.
You know?
Obviously, in Hollywood Gate, there were opportunities to frankly break news, as we would say. And I'm talking about, you know, the Russians and what they were attempting to do in Afghanistan, fighting a covert war, essentially.
Well, you know, Christo Grozev, who I worked with so closely on Navalny, he is just the most genius investigator. And for the last 4 years, he's been on and off working on an investigation about Russia's involvement with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And then he saw I sent him early footage when I started working on it, because I was like, look, this is really interesting. But at that point, we hadn't shot these shots at the end with Arkhipov and the Russians, Iranians, et cetera, that you see on the stage at the end of the film. And when he saw the full film, I think it was in June here in London, he immediately, in his sort of Christo style, did like the reverse face search and started figuring out who's this Russian guy on the stage. And it was the missing link to this huge investigation around a Russian bounty program where they were basically paying the Taliban per head of U.S. soldier that they were able to kill, which led to many suicide bombings and
some of the biggest attacks.
Right, attacks on U.S. convoys, U.S. bases. And this was, at the time, covered up because the negotiations with the White House, with the Taliban were going on. And then even when Biden came to power, it was continued. They continued to sort of not look at that situation. And so,
as if not to muddy the waters.
Right. And this whole investigation is now out, as you see in
the New York Times. Yeah, it's, to a journalist, it looks as if, you know, just the great game is alive and well when you're talking about so many different powers. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, when you see reports of Russian interference, whether it be in Afghanistan or elsewhere, elections, for example, in the United States, you don't find any of this surprising.
No, and I think that is the genius of this kind of filmmaking and documentary filmmaking, where you just capture and you're there and you capture. Like at the time, we didn't know that we were capturing these individuals, right?
Yeah.
And you just make the film, and these kind of films are so hard to make and so hard to distribute these days.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that this huge investigation shows the value of this kind of filmmaking, that it helps us sort of. You know, it's a deeper look and a deeper investigation, and helps us to understand the world we're living in better.
I imagine that sort of ability to go, to spend the time, to engage with the people at this kind of level, over days, over months, over years.
Mm-hmm.
Very different from what the mainstream media is able to accomplish simply because of budget. What is the toughest thing in that sense for documentary filmmakers? Is it the budgeting? Is it the time constraints? I mean, where's the sort of challenge there?
It's the life.
Because you are giving up your
limitation,
life.
right?
Yeah.
Like in Ukraine, I think I'd lived there for 6, 7, 8 months, sort of back and forth on those overnight trains. You know, living
it's
out
literal
of
immersion.
suitcase. It really is, and you just like, as far as another life, like I don't have a family, I don't have kids. You know, it is. It takes...
That's what it requires.
It does. It requires a lot from you.
Yeah. Do you think that the value there, obviously, is that you do get that firsthand knowledge?
Yes, and like for me, I just love it. You know, I love my work. I love understanding the truth, like being able to be with Kuleba and Rustem, etc., during like these critical points, and just watching the day-to-day unfold. You have an understanding of this war, of this conflict, of the multiple sides to it, and nothing is black and white. You know, and I have, even with the Alexei, with Navalny, sitting there in the Black Forest for those days and knowing them so well, you just understand things in a different way, in a deeper way than, I don't know. And that for me is super fulfilling.
No doubt, no doubt.
I mean, I'm sure that's what drives you as a journalist as well. It's just like having these conversations, having these intimate understanding of different perspectives, you know. And I've always been someone who loves different perspectives, because I grew up that way. Like I lived in Asia, I lived in Canada, Japan, all these cultures that you had to sort of assimilate into. And that for me is life, really. Like when I can, it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with all the perspectives, but just being able to see different perspectives is super fulfilling.
What was most surprising to you in making Hollywood Gate?
Well,
the scene where they are in the gym.
I would say, the gym, for sure.
Yeah.
But
high on the unintentional comedy scale.
Yeah, exactly, unintentional comedy scale. But I think just how deep the ignorance is, also. You know, around their vision, their definition of women, and women's society around women, and just their narrative around the world, even. Like, it's just, you know, they have had zero exposure to, like, you know, what's happening outside that little bubble.
For filmmakers, you're there for a long time. Mm-hmm. How does timing work?
Yeah, and then, you know, it's so key. Like, for example, we had to put out Hollywood Gate in an election year.
Yeah.
Which was difficult, because it sort of shows a critical look at what happened around the pullout, which then everyone ends up blaming Biden for. So then people are afraid to...
The politicizing of the film.
The politicizing of the film, but it has nothing to do with Biden. This is a problem that was created over 20 years with
multiple administrations.
2 Democratic, 2 Republican.
Yes.
And it's like, we just need to look at this as a whole, and as a country, as an American citizen, it's my responsibility to question our foreign policy.
Yeah.
And yet, like, you know, people are so afraid that it would be, you know, looked at as troublesome for Biden, and that's just the wrong lens to look at it through.
Do you think that
it was very difficult? No, I think it is. It really is. That problem was created by 4 different administrations.
Yeah.
They all equally hold the burden, and they, you know, should have communicated and come together to create a different solution there. Not each new administration coming in and creating their own goals, right?
Yeah. What do you want audiences to walk away with from Hollywoodgate?
Well, I think Hollywoodgate walks this fine line of, you see the Taliban that are, in the Western media, we've spent 20 years pushing one narrative of them, which is just problematic, and these killers that are just living in caves and they're just killing and killing, killing. And then you see in the Taliban in Hollywoodgate that they also eat, they also sleep, they also are funny, they're
human.
Kind of weird. They're human, right?
Yeah.
And so at the same time, not apologizing for them, not saying like, okay, wait, just not trying to humanize, but at the same time seeing that they are humans, looking at this and going, okay, hold on a second. Maybe we should try a different approach, right? Because they're obviously just deeply uneducated, are a product of 40 years of war, that have only lived in caves and been taught war, and grown up with war, fed war.
Yes.
Right? And is there something else that we can do? Is there some other approach that we can take?
Yeah. Desiree, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place. Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, an explosion in Moscow kills a top Russian general in charge of the country's nuclear, biological and chemical defense forces. We'll be speaking to a former captain in Russia's special forces. Syria's new leadership is stepping up its global outreach in an effort to reverse the economic sanctions imposed under the Assad regime. Could this also lead to a potential removal from the terror list? And the US President-elect Donald Trump is urging the military to share more information about drone sightings in parts of the country where the general public is growing increasingly frustrated about the lack of answers. Hello and welcome to the programme. We start with Russia, where an explosion has killed a top general leading the country's nuclear, biological and chemical defence forces. Well, various reports citing a source from Ukraine's SBU intelligence service confirm that the Ukrainian agency was behind that blast. Well, the explosion that killed Lieutenant General Igor Kirillo was hidden in an electric scooter. All of this some 7 kilometres from the Kremlin, according to Russia's investigative committee, which has called this a terrorist act. Well, the blast was triggered remotely, according to the Russian TASS news agency. Well, the general's assistant, who's been identified as Ilya Polikarpov by Russian media, was also killed. Well, following on from that incident, the former president and deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, who is also a key ally of the Russian President Vladimir Putin, says that Ukraine will face retribution for this killing. Well, for more, we're joined now by a former captain in Russia's special forces, the GRU Spetsnaz, Boris Volodarsky. Thank you so much for your time. What more do you know about the circumstances of what happened earlier today in a Moscow suburb?
I don't think I know anything more than was repeated by international media. I read Russian sources. They're more or less saying the same. There was a very detailed report by the BBC. Igor was talking, and he was probably reporting from Moscow. He was using sources close to Moscow, but there's nothing special to clarify more the case. Everything shows, and the reports from Kyiv confirm, although indirectly, that was the work of the SBU, which is the security service, so intelligence service of Ukraine, and that was one of their retribution acts against the general who is known to have committed a lot of war crimes using chemical weapons against the Ukrainian population and against the Ukrainian army.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about Lieutenant General Igor Kirillo, who was, of course, as we were saying, killed with his assistant. I mean, tell us who he was, and did you know him?
I didn't know him personally, but Kirillo has become very active in the past time. He, unlike other generals, other leading generals who are taking part in the war against Ukraine, Russian war against Ukraine, he has been giving press conferences, talking a lot. They were discussing the bogus program. They were saying that the Americans are developing biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine, always calling for retribution. They were, together with several other people, he was talking about plenty of secret American and NATO laboratories in Ukraine and all that sort of things. That, of course, it was not confirmed. Never any facts were produced. As I said, he became very active. What is more known about him, that allegedly he ordered more than 48 attacks on the Ukrainian forces using weapons, chemical and chemical weapons that are forbidden by international laws. So, to my mind, the act was completely justified.
Okay, so you're saying he was a legitimate target based on what he's done to the Ukrainian people. Fair to say he's the most high-profile person to be targeted so far since the start of the Ukraine war?
So far as I know, yes, he was the highest-ranking general, although there were quite a lot of, more than 10 Russian generals perished during this war, were killed either in battle or in other ways during bombardments. But if we talk about assassination, yes, he was the highest-ranking general.
As we've been saying, he was the head of Russia's nuclear, biological, and chemicals protection troops. Wouldn't Russia presumably try to do the same if they could? Wouldn't Russia want to try and target a similar profile of individual were one to exist in the Ukrainian military?
At the beginning of the war, in February 22, there were quite a lot of attacks or attempts by Russian special forces, and Spetsnaz of Russia has specifically been trained and actually existed to carry out such operations behind the lines. And I know for sure that the GRU Spetsnaz were trying many times, specifically in Kiev. There were a lot of groups. As far as I heard, more than 50 groups were placed on the Ukrainian territory to Kiev and nearby Kiev, trying to commit several acts of sabotage, assassination, subversion, and all that sort of things. But they were quite unsuccessful, and as a matter of fact, could not fully carry out their missions, and their missions stopped at a certain time during the war.
When you look at his profile, you know, as we've been saying, a senior person in the ranks of the Russian army. I mean, are you surprised at the security or lack thereof that allowed something like this to happen?
Not very much, actually. General Kirillo graduated from the Russian Academy specialized on radiological chemical weapons, and for a number of years he was heading the academy before the war started, as far as I know. Russian generals, especially high-profile, high-ranking generals, are feeling quite secure in Moscow and nearby Moscow, as far as they're not sent to the front. So he did not have any special protection, and probably he did not expect any such acts. But these acts, I'm sure, will carry on.
And therefore likely to prompt something of a review with regards to the security detail given to high-profile individuals like him.
I don't think Russia is able to secure, to provide enough security for all their generals who are taking part in this war. So I don't think any specific measures will be taken against them, or to protect them, actually.
Is this slightly embarrassing, would you say, for the Kremlin?
One might say, yes, this is slightly embarrassing for the Kremlin, but under the current circumstances, the loss of one general even this high-ranking general is not a big problem for them at all. They are losing over 1,200, 1,500 soldiers every day, which again they're not considering as a big problem. This is normal for Putin. He sacrificed a lot of human lives to achieve his aims.
Before we crossed you, we were saying that the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, says Russia will carry out revenge for the killing of that general. What do you think he's got in mind?
Whatever former President Medvedev is saying, especially in the past time, especially since Russia started its aggression against Ukraine, no one is taken seriously and even is not considering as a serious claim. He's saying a lot of things that are completely unimportant. He's not responsible for anything what he says.
And what do you think the Russian public makes of all of this? I mean, do you think it's stirred up further discussion about the wisdom of having invaded Ukraine in the first place?
I don't think there will be a lot of news about this assassination in the Russian media, and Russian public would probably not react. It's just one of the next victims, and whether it's a general or a major or a colonel, well, just one of the next victims in the war, they would probably not pay much attention. Much more interesting for them and the growing prices, credits, and lack of essential goods, lack of things that they're used to for many years. So that what worries and what interests the Russian public. The death of another general is of no interest at all.
And when you heard that Lieutenant General Igor Kirillo had been killed, I mean, what went through your mind this morning?
I immediately thought that Ukraine has achieved another victory, a small victory, and they were able to show to the Russians that they are not secure even on the Russian territory, which to my mind was a good move. It was a successful Ukrainian operation.
And just to sort of wrap up, I mean, we're coming up to nearly 3 years since the start of the Russian invasion. We've got a new administration about to take office in Washington in about a month from now. Donald Trump has spoken about the war in Ukraine, calling it carnage. And most recently, he said Putin and Zelensky got to make a deal. Says a solution must be found. I mean, are you confident that it will be?
I do not think that the new administration in Washington will be able to do anything, because President Putin is definitely not interested in stopping this war, and Ukraine is quite definitely not interested in losing the territories temporarily occupied by the Russians today. So I don't see how, in which way, the newly elected President Trump going to solve this problem. He already saw that he announced during his election campaign that he will solve this during 3 days, or 5 days, or 1 day. He already realizes very well that it's not possible. I doubt that would be possible without any very, very specific idea, very interesting idea. But this idea could only be a full support of Ukraine. So Russia should understand that for them to continue this war is completely senseless or even dangerous for their state. This, to my mind, is the only way how you can stop this conflict.
All right. Captain Wolodarsky, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. In other world news, Syria's new rulers are stepping up their engagement with the rest of the world. Yesterday, the Syrian UN envoy arrived in Damascus, and today France sent a delegation with Special Envoy Jean-François Guillaume offering support for Syria's transition. Additionally, the French flag has now been raised at the embassy in Damascus for the first time since 2012.
We are here to be alongside the Syrian people. Through this gesture, we wish to show that France is preparing to be with Syrians for the long term, and I am also here to make contact with the de facto authorities in Damascus, who will enable us to ensure the security of this diplomatic compound and of all the French compounds, and who will enable France to resume its work alongside the Syrians during this period.
Well, the French aren't the only ones who've been focusing on Damascus. German diplomats have also been present, and they've been discussing the protection of minorities and the possibilities for establishing a diplomatic presence there. Well, these diplomatic interactions could lead to the eventual lifting of sanctions imposed on Syria under the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Well, in a meeting with British diplomats, Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Shara, emphasised the importance of sanctions relief and how it could benefit the Syrian people, especially those who have been displaced. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Hagar Shamali, who is a former National Security Council Director for Lebanon and Syria under the administration of President Barack Obama, who joins us now from New York. Hagar, great to have you with us on the programme. Clearly, you've been monitoring these developments in Syria, in particular the last few weeks. I mean, what are your thoughts on what's happened there?
Well, it's just stunning. You know, when I was director for Syria and Lebanon at the White House, and that was during the first 2 years of the Syria crisis, we used to say that it was not a matter of if, but when Bashar al-Assad would fall. Clearly, we didn't anticipate that it would happen 13 years later. But, you know, I was overjoyed to see him run like a coward to Moscow. And though I am concerned, of course, of the potential for risks and instability in Syria, but my first two thoughts were just the incredible shift in geopolitical dynamics, because this wouldn't have happened had you not had the weakening of Assad's, what I like to call, club of baddies. You have Iran, that has been on the defense, it's been humiliated by Israel, and is literally on the defense since Israel struck its defense capabilities. You have Hezbollah that's been decapitated and decimated. Hamas, which is on its own, is practically eradicated. And then you have Russia, which has spent its resources, is relying on North Korea to help in its war in Ukraine, which is what's consuming Russia right now. And these are the players that propped Assad up, notably Russia in 2014, is really what shifted the tides in favor of Assad back during the civil war. So given that weakening, and also given the fact that Assad, since the ceasefire in 2020 between Assad and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because nothing had happened since then, Assad did absolutely nothing to placate his constituents, to support them for the reasons for which they had been protesting to begin with. On the contrary, he turned Syria into a narco state. His own military didn't want to support him and were scared. And no dictator can stand without their military. And that's a rule in our history. And so when the military defected this way, that's also what allowed these rebels to so swiftly take Damascus. It was absolutely stunning, and certainly not on anybody's 2024 bingo card.
Yeah, indeed, a very surprising and rapid turn of events. And I just want to ask you, I mean, we've heard a lot of diplomats have been descending on Damascus the last couple of days. The US obviously sounding cautious, like lots of countries, with regards to the new leadership in Damascus. I mean, do you think the US is playing its cards right as things stand?
Well, yes, to put it simply, because they have to be cautious. And you base it in fact. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, you just have to look at their history. And I'm talking about recent history. If you look at their older history, they were an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. When I was in the US government and we sanctioned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it was because it was Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria. And since then, as we know publicly, Ahmed al-Shara, his nom de guerre was Mohammed al-Julani. He had disavowed global terrorism. He cut ties with Al-Qaeda and rebranded the group as a group focused on Syria's independence and liberation, and then adopted this new name. The original name was the Al-Nusra Front. But the United States is not the only one that sanctioned this group, and it's not only the UK either, but the United Nations did as well, which means that all UN member states technically sanctioned this group. And so that's the history. But if you just look at recently, as September 2024, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was repressing protesters with excessive force in the northwest of Syria and Idlib, in the area that it was controlling. It also was arbitrarily detaining people. There was a British aid worker who said that he was detained, he tortured while he was detained. Islamists in the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham militia assassinated famous, well-known human rights activist in Syria, Raed Faris. So this is their track record. And so we have to be very careful, given that this is a group that, when it was governing the corner of northwest Syria up until 2 weeks ago, was governing with repression, with an extreme Sunni Islamist ideology. You have to imagine that is what they might, that might be their agenda, although Mohammed al-Julani or Ahmed al-Shara is saying all the right things, and he is saying all the right things. But the US has to maintain some of those sanctions as leverage to make sure that his actions are backed up with the words that he's giving, that he walks the walk and not talks the talk only.
And Javier, just to clarify with you, when you're talking about sanctions, I mean, obviously Syria is currently held back by two separate sets of sanctions, those targeting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which is now gone, and of course HTS is on this list of designated terror organizations. I mean, is the United States likely to remove either of those two designations, both of which could be viewed as holding Syria back?
Right. The sanctions related to the Assad regime are more likely to be considered for withdrawal in the near term. And I imagine the U.S. diplomats who are going to Damascus, who are engaging with European allies, with HTS as well, are trying to figure out what sanctions could be removed that would no longer pose any kind of threat, because those sanctions to begin with were placed to prevent Assad from raising, moving, and storing funds so that he couldn't finance his war machine and that he couldn't use his power and abuse it for the benefit of himself and his own family. And so those sanctions, a lot of them can be removed. I don't think anything related to him personally would be removed, but he's in Moscow anyway. But things like, for example, the Central Bank of Syria, that was sanctioned when I was at the White House, and because it was viewed as a key element that was propping up the Assad's war machine. But if we're trying to pursue humanitarian aid now and get the economy going, those are sanctions that could be considered for withdrawal. When it comes to sanctions regarding Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this is much more difficult because usually when sanctions are imposed, you stipulate the reasons for which they were sanctioned, and it's under U.S. law. And so we cannot, for political reasons, just remove a sanction or for reasons to hope. They have to prove that they're no longer engaged in the activity for which they were sanctioned. And like I said, for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in particular, the U.S. might use that as a piece of leverage to say, well, listen, you've given all these promises. You've promised to protect minorities. You've promised to hold fair elections. We're going to hold that in place just in case until we see that you've achieved these number of steps or promises, and then we'll release those sanctions at the end of that. But they're not going to do it at the beginning. Okay, and obviously Syria in a stage of a phase of transition through to March with this transitional leadership. The United States also in something of a transitional phase as well, with the new leadership due to take office in just a few weeks from now. Are you expecting to see a big change in U.S. approach, do you think, between the Biden administration and that of the incoming President-elect Donald Trump? To be frank with you, I don't expect that big of a change between the two because neither of them really prioritized Syria back when Trump was in office during his first term, and neither did President Biden now in the last 4 years. And when everything was unfolding in Syria, President-elect Trump put out a tweet right away, a post saying, I hope that the U.S. doesn't get involved. This is not something that they should be involved in. And to be honest with you, from the beginning, when I handled, as I mentioned, the first 2 years of the Syria crisis, and the U.S. was accused of, quote, leading from behind, not an expression the American officials liked. But the fact is that the U.S. did not get heavily involved in Syria. We didn't threaten military intervention, for example, in response to Bashar al-Assad's atrocities. And that's left a sour taste, if you will, for Syrians, for many, many Syrians who feel very deceived, if you will, by the U.S. and the Europeans and the international community in general. So we have to tread very carefully. And while Syria does pose a great national security, there are many national security objectives for the United States. It's surrounded by U.S. allies. We don't want to see spillover of any kind of instability or rebels gone wild or terrorist groups proliferating. And we don't want to see them going into Lebanon or Jordan. We don't want to see them posing a threat to Israel, toward Iraq, or certainly to Turkey. And so Syria is important. And Syria used to be the land bridge between Iran and Hezbollah, and now it won't be any more likely. And that's an exciting opportunity. And so there is an interest in ensuring that things don't devolve into chaos in Syria, but without a heavy hand. It has to be somewhat light in a supportive role, given the last 8 to 10 years. But again, I don't expect a significant difference. I do expect the focus to be on maintaining we have a U.S. presence of just under 1,000 troops in the northeast of Syria. They are there to support the Kurds in preventing the reemergence of ISIS. President-elect Trump didn't really understand that the first term, but I do believe he understands why that troop presence is important now, and I expect them to maintain that, because preventing the reemergence of ISIS is critical, and certainly fighting for the release of American journalist Austin Tice, who's been detained in Syria since 2012 and who is believed to be alive.
I mean, we were talking just before we crossed you about the countries that have gone to Damascus to establish, the early stages of a diplomatic presence after a very long absence in some cases. Which countries' presence and which countries' involvement at this stage would you say is most important to the success or the failure of this new administration in Damascus?
It's a great question. To me, it really, you have to have the Middle Eastern countries, particularly the Gulf in particular. There is a shift, and this is what I meant earlier when we were talking about the geopolitical dynamics. It's the so-called axis of resistance is crumbling, if not crumbled. And that really shifts things in the Middle East if you look at the region alone. And it shifts things away from the axis of resistance toward an agenda that is more pro-international, frankly, wants to play by the rules, wants to be part of the international community. And so I expect especially in the Gulf in particular, which has a much stronger economy, has a system of governance that they can share, and also that they had already established certain relationships. Now, this is the most important. At the same time, while I agree, and I mentioned earlier that the U.S. and Europe, their influence is weaker because they didn't play a heavy hand over the last 12, 13 years. However, you don't want at the same time a country like Turkey that is trying to play a very heavy role. They have already invaded the north of Syria quite significantly. We don't want Turkey to play that hand in their favor. We don't want a country like Russia or China swooping in and trying to push things in their favor. Russia's probably more on the defense at this point, but still, for that reason, it's also you also really want the U.S. and European influence and other countries that do have Syria's best interest at heart, that civilians are protected, that things are stable, that they remain stable, that for areas of Syria that are currently not under any control, that they don't devolve into chaos, that other rebel groups with other agendas don't seek to take advantage of that. It will be difficult, though. I don't want to make it seem like pursuing a stable transition to democracy is going to be easy, as excited as I am for the Syrian people, because they've never been closer to freedom. However, history has proven to us that when you have an Islamist militia take control, they make many promises, and often they discover that in order to stay in control, they end up pursuing repressive tactics. And so dangling those carrots of, hey, we could remove sanctions, and hey, you could be part of the international financial system if you actually transition and you say what you're going to do. They could be very valuable, but it does take players all over the world.
Okay, and obviously lots of countries want to get involved in what's happening in Syria. It's a strategically incredibly important country with lots of borders. Doesn't sound like you think, perhaps, and talking to other people on this program, doesn't sound like many people think Russia and Iran are going to be too much involved in the next few months, at any rate, not in the medium term. But with regards to Turkey, some people really crediting President Recep Tayyip Erdogan with having played his hand masterfully with regards to the situation there, and really emerging there as a major global player. I mean, do you agree that he's been skillful in terms of how he's managed his country's relationship with Syria, and how things are going to unfold there?
Well, I'm loath to ever really say that the Turkish president is Erdogan is playing his hand skillfully, because I don't trust his agenda. And I don't believe that he's governed his own country very well at all, whether it's regarding repression or the economy. And even from my own experience in government, I always found that his interest was to be some kind of regional hegemon. And frankly, much of the Middle East rejects that. They didn't like it the first 400 years of the Ottoman Empire. They certainly don't like it now. And so while you could argue that he's played it somewhat masterfully in that he has chosen a winning side, at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean it may work for international relations. It may work in terms of future investment, but I don't believe it's going to work in terms of pushing strong influence across the entire country, because there is there is a lot of distrust, and that is across the Levant and across the region. There's a lot of distrust of President Erdogan. And so, and again, there's going to be an inevitable balance of power. I don't think Erdogan is going to really be able to play this too much. And he has an interest as well in pushing back and confronting the Kurds, for example, which is likely why they have invaded that northern part of Syria. So played his hand well, sure, we could say that for this time period, but I'd be loath to say that that it's going to end up being this big win or huge win that Erdogan likely envisions.
I know Lebanon is a country very close to your heart, and it was close to your portfolio under President Barack Obama. I mean, obviously, Lebanon has itself been through considerable upheaval the last few months and years, in fact. How closely intertwined would you say the fortunes of Syria and Lebanon are moving forward?
Yes, the dominoes that will continue to fall because of Assad's collapse will be stunning. And so one of the things, as I mentioned, is that you've got the fact that Syria can no longer be this land bridge between Iran and Hezbollah. And so given that Hezbollah has already had its arsenal significantly hit, its leadership and commanders mostly killed off, the fact that it's lost its ability to even be able to resupply following the ceasefire that you've had now between Lebanon and Israel. That is huge. And the reason that's huge is because Hezbollah is the one that's been holding Lebanon hostage for decades now. And with every year that passed, they were only getting stronger and stronger, preventing a president from taking office, turning the country into a narco state, using all of its resources to further its criminal goals, whether it was using the airport and ports to pursue money laundering and other nefarious behavior. It's Hezbollah has been the cancer that has been eating away at Lebanon. And so it's exciting because not only has it been decimated by Israel significantly in a way that none of us foresaw this year, but now it doesn't even have a chance to resupply itself. So it's on its back heels. And that will allow Lebanon, if the Lebanese leaders can really unite, and that's a tough one in Lebanon, but if they can really unite, if you have the Speaker of the House, Nabi Berri, and you have the Prime Minister, Miati, and you have and they agree to have elections to hold a president finally. And then they unite with the goal of actually installing in Lebanon a system that is much more cleaner, much more fair, focused on actually improving its economy. Now, again, I feel like I'm shooting for the stars here, but at least this time it feels like they have a chance, whereas Hezbollah was really holding them back. And that's what I'm most excited about to see in Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, just wrapping up because we're out of time, but Hagar, you sound pretty optimistic just listening to what you were saying there.
Do I sound optimistic? I think I would say that is the Middle East going to be safer this year? And I would say yes and no. You're going to see, because of these shifts in geopolitical dynamics, certain things work out for the better. For example, like I mentioned in Lebanon, in Syria, I'm worried. I am happy that Bashar al-Assad is gone. I don't want to pretend like I'm not, but I am very worried because it's very tenuous. So we're going to see, I think, in 2025, certainly a mix of some good things and perhaps some concerning things as well.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Hagar Shamali, thanks again.
Thank you.
Now turning our attention to Gaza, and with its military power depleted and its political influence waning, Hamas is under growing public pressure to help bring the war in Gaza to an end. This, as Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz said earlier on Tuesday that his country's forces will be free to act in the Gaza Strip even after the war with Hamas ends. On the ground, many residents say they're increasingly fed up with Hamas as they struggle to survive. Well, the Washington Post, meanwhile, is reporting that a new proposal for a 60-day pause in hostilities and the exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners includes some key concessions from Hamas. Meanwhile, the families of the hostages still being held in Gaza have once again been taking to the streets of Tel Aviv. They're calling for a full deal to release all of those still being held in the Palestinian territory. Of the 96 hostages still held there, 62 are assumed by Israel still to be alive. Well, relatives of the hostages in Gaza are hoping that the incoming US President Donald Trump will intervene.
We hope to get a good news from Benjamin Netanyahu, and we hope to have the support of President Biden, of the next president, Donald Trump. We really hope that they're going to support us, that they're going to help us to seal the deal as soon as possible.
Very tough situation to be in. We believe that the state of Israel should go to a full deal to release all the hostages in one time and to stop the war in Gaza. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister have other political reasons to do a deal which can result in the death of the hostages that are left behind.
Okay, well, let's get some more analysis now, and we can speak to Miri Aysin, who is the former Israeli intelligence officer and lecturer on Middle Eastern security and diplomacy. Thank you for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Lots seems to be happening. We've got reports coming in left and right. We're being told Benjamin Netanyahu could be heading to Cairo for talks. Reuters saying a ceasefire deal expected in the coming days. I mean, very hard to speculate, but obviously, if confirmed, all of this is very significant, isn't it?
It's always significant after 438 days of Hamas coming into Israel and taking those hundreds of hostages of you said 96, I say 100, you're right, 4 from before, but those are 100, both bodies and people that have been held there for so long. So for me as an Israeli, if 5 come home alive, let alone if 10, 20, or all of them would come home, that's incredibly significant. But I look also at the Hamas side, and I say sadly, I don't believe Hamas. I don't think that they will let them out. So I want to dampen a bit everybody's enthusiasm. I think that we need to be realistic.
Sure, and we've been here before, haven't we? So I think the management of expectations is absolutely key. We did hear, though, the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz saying an agreement is closer than ever. In terms of sticking points, obviously, there are some established sticking points, the same ones that have been around for a while. I mean, at this late stage, I mean, what are likely to be some hurdles in these final crucial stages, would you think?
Hamas has been holding the 100 people that they took both on October 6th and on October 7th, and also before that. They've held them in that sense, and they've never said who's really there. And I think sticking point number one is, can we actually know after 438 days from the terror organization the list of the people that they actually have who's held there? Is the Bibas family there? Are they alive? We've never heard that since October 7th, 2023. I say that as a sticking point because I'm still not sure right now that they actually have given the full list. Hamas used that as a bargaining chip, as an inhumane, impossible idea. An additional type of sticking point is the issue of there's definitely going to be a ceasefire. A ceasefire means we will stop fighting, and then Hamas terror fighters have to stop fighting. But the sticking point would be, where does Israel redeploy in the Gaza Strip, on the edge of the Gaza Strip? That would be a second sticking point.
I mean, this conflict's been going on for 14 months. There hasn't been a pause in the fighting for more than a year now. I mean, why do you think the negotiations have been ineffectual? Do you think that's what this is all about? Or do you think they're the wrong people at the negotiating table?
Wow, Tom, I actually have a different opinion than most people, because to me they have been ineffective because we look at the Hamas as a legitimate partner for negotiations. Hamas is a terror organization. They took these people, they took these hostages from their home in a terror act. And I say it with those harsh words because for them, the hostages that they took are bargaining chips. For them, Hamas, the hostages are actually worth just as much dead as alive. Hamas executed 6 hostages in August rather than have them taken by Israel. Hamas recorded before they were executed their last words to impact us psychologically. That is terrorism. For a moment, I don't want to belittle the fact that we need to give, but there's this expectation as if Hamas did something legit. Now it's about negotiations. No, they did something horrific and terrible. And how can you negotiate with somebody who prefers to execute 6 hostages as they did in August rather than have us get to them?
I mean, Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip for 17 years now. I mean, fair to say, as some analysts are saying at this moment, they have never looked so weak. And that being the case, it stands to reason, doesn't it, that their negotiating positions will have been quite significantly revisited.
In the last few weeks, with the events that happened, momentous events for all of us, Tom, we're all in the Middle East right now, of what happened in Syria, it's like a two-stage step. Because initially that enormously weakened Hamas. Hamas's backers were Hezbollah, and backers, I say in the sense that they participated, not because they were the ones that were in the Gaza Strip, but Hezbollah, when they went to a ceasefire up in Lebanon, that weakened Hamas. In the aftermath of what happened now with the overtaking of all of Syria, with the ousting of the horrific barbaric dictator Bashar al-Assad, that weakened Hamas. Having said that, what happens now inside Syria is a double-edged sword, because Hamas is Muslim Brotherhood, and Syria had a very significant Muslim Brotherhood before the war, before 2011. And the question is, will the Muslim Brotherhood Syria back Muslim Brotherhood Hamas, and suddenly that'll give them more wind? So we're at a tricky point where I do think that Hamas is weakened, and I think it's an important point to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, the Washington Post, again, saying, they're quoting a Hamas member who wanted to remain anonymous, there is, quote, a desire to end the war at any cost. I mean, do you think, given the suffering that has been experienced by the people of Gaza, that that's likely to be a widely held opinion at this stage?
So as a widely held opinion, I don't know if any of us know what's really happening inside the Gaza Strip. I think that it is horrific for the 2.3 million people who live there and what they've lived through. They are part of the Palestinian arena. They live inside the Gaza Strip, and I am sure that they are beyond. This isn't tired. This is horrific, 14 months as it is. I want to hope that in that sense, Hamas, that put an exceedingly extreme jihadist point of view in the attack on October 7th, in the way that they've presented it ever since, that has been weakened. I hope that for all of us, especially for the day after. I don't think anybody wants, not inside the Gaza Strip and not outside the world, for the kind of modus operandi of attacking a country, taking hostages, holding them, and allowing, in that sense, Israel to attack Hamas to try to get to the hostages. And we have killed so many civilians while we were targeting Hamas. This is not a modus operandi anybody wants to repeat, and not in the Gaza Strip, not in the West Bank, nowhere in the world. So let's hope very much that in that sense, Hamas is not just tired, but that they feel in that sense that what they've done has not given them what they intended from October 7th, which is both the annihilation of the state of Israel, but it's also about showing everybody how they were, the oppressed against the oppressor. Look at what they have done, both to themselves and to their people.
You make a lot of interesting points. I just want to pick up on one of them. Earlier in your answer, you talked about the day after situation in Gaza. And I'm just wondering what post-war plans for Gaza look like from an Israeli perspective. I mean, we don't know that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, has a plan, but his Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has been saying that Israeli forces will be, quote, free to act in Gaza after the war ends. I mean, that suggests a long-term presence. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are as to what it's going to look like once the war's over.
So first of all, none of us know, Tom, and that's really something that we need to say on the table. The Israeli decisions that have been made by the government are not ones that I, Miri, both as an analyst to somebody who comes from this in the arena, necessarily support. I long ago said that the 2.3 million people are going to be there afterwards. The 2.3 million people are Palestinians. What they want, what they need to a certain degree, is a Palestinian to rule them, not Israel. I also think that in leaving it open, what you do is you create chaos. And I say, sadly, in the last few months, we've seen more of that type of chaos. Having said that, I live inside Israel, and the government that I have right now that I may not support is one that has a much harder line, as you said before. But this government also wants to survive both in Israel and around the arena. And if they don't, the government doesn't compromise on what's happening in the war in the Gaza Strip, we don't get back hostages, we don't stop. So that for me, the day after, at the end, is going to be some kind of Palestinian leadership. I really, really think that we don't want and can't view a Hamas leadership there. So it'll be other ones, Who they are, I can't say right now. I don't know which ones would be acceptable to the Israeli government. Many more would be acceptable to the popular Israeli public. It's going to be Palestinians, hopefully backed by the more moderate Sunni voices throughout the greater Middle East and not the more extreme Sunni voices. Because at the end, Hamas is hardcore Muslim Brotherhood, and we need to accept as such. That's going to be our neighbors in the future as well.
Okay, so a fast-moving situation. Miriam, thank you very much for helping us to make sense of it. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Now, turning our attention to the United States, where local and federal authorities are attempting to reassure the public as multiple drone sightings on the East Coast have been raising security concerns and fueling conspiracy theories. Well, in a televised statement, the US President-elect Donald Trump has urged the US military to inform the public about what's going on.
The government knows what is happening. Look, our military knows where they took off from. If it's a garage, they can go right into that garage. They know where it came from and where it went. And for some reason, they don't want to comment. And I think they'd be better off saying what it is. Our military knows and our president knows. And for some reason, they want to keep people in suspense. I can't imagine it's the enemy, because if it was the enemy, they'd blast it out. Even if they were late, they'd blast it. Something strange is going on. For some reason, they don't want to tell the people. And they should, because the people are really, I mean, they happen to be over Bedminster. Want to know the truth? They're very close to Bedminster. I think maybe I won't spend the weekend in Bedminster. I've decided to cancel my trip.
The US President-elect Donald Trump speaking there, while responding to the reported drone sightings. The Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Aviation Authority, and the Department of Defense released a joint statement saying that the FBI has received more than 5,000 tip-offs, from which 100 leads have been generated. Well, advanced tech and expert visual observers have been reportedly sent to the region. Well, the agencies report that the sightings are a combination of lawful, commercial, hobbyist and law enforcement drones, as well as mistaken identifications of aircraft, helicopters and stars. Well, the authorities are reiterating that the drone activity to date does not pose a national security or public safety risk. Well, as the number of sightings continues to grow, some elected officials and mayors are left with little to no information to share with their constituents. Local authorities are reportedly uninformed, while a lack of answers from federal officials has left many frustrated. Well, from the Mine Hill Township in New Jersey, where there have been multiple drone sightings, I'm joined now by the mayor, Sam Morris. Thank you so much for joining us, Mayor Morris. For our viewers who don't know much about Mine Hill Township, it's in Morris County, New Jersey, got a population of around 4,000. Do correct me if I'm wrong. But tell me, what's the mood there like now?
The mood is unsettled. It's, you know, since this started a month ago, the mood has been, you know, there are people who are very blasé about it. Not everyone is upset and very stressed, but, you know, there are also a lot of residents who are very distressed about it. They're very upset. It's causing emotional concerns for them. People do not like unknown things flying over their head. You know, we understand we have a regulated airspace in this country, you know, all countries. We understand planes are up and that planes can crash and things like that. But it's the unknown that makes you very uncomfortable. And that's what has people concerned right now.
Yeah, and you yourself have been out with your camera or your smartphone, I don't know which, doing some filming. We can look at some of the pictures you've filmed. There is your own video footage. I mean, as you've filmed what we're looking at now on our screens, and we're looking at what appears to be a football pitch with some lights. I mean, they are hard to show on television, I have to admit, but they are there. We can see them. I mean, what was going through your head as you filmed that?
Shock and surprise. I was notified that evening by a resident that lived right, that was over our municipal complex where our school and our town hall and fields and all are. And was notified by a resident that there were drones over the area. And I came around here and shot that footage myself. It was, took a minute to get oriented, but, you're watching the way they're moving, you're watching them, that they're stationary. That same evening, my wife had a drone go over her car, which she was very uncomfortable about. She called me very upset. But it's while you take people seriously and you take people, you give people the benefit of the doubt until you see it for your own eyes and you see it in the way that I filmed it. There's always a little doubt in there, but now, it removes all doubt.
Yeah, I mean, you've just raised some really important points. First of all, I'm just wondering how large these objects are that are flying around in the skies above where you live. And just tell us a bit more about it, if you don't mind. What happened to your wife?
Well, people are reporting various sizes, but the ones that they get more attention, they're larger. I know I can tell you the one that my wife saw. She thought it was size of her car hood. Now, a commercial drone are known to be that size. They could be 3 or 4 feet square, or a meter and a half square. But some people are reporting these things to be as big as a pickup truck or bigger. And that is to have that over your head and not know what it is and not know if it's regulated and not know if it's friend or foe. That's a very concerning thing.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of people in the area have got their telescopes out trying to get a closer view of what these things are, because just a bright light on its own doesn't offer enough information. I mean, you hearing a similar sense of frustration and anxiety, really, from your fellow mayors in other parts of New Jersey and other parts of the United States?
Yeah, this all started, just to go back to one point, it's not the bright light, it's the movement. These drones have been working in a grid pattern. They go over an area and they go left and right, or north and south, or east and west, and they go in a pattern that you can see is programmed. It's not like, well, they just zip around and go in, any pattern. They have very specific scanning, it looks like they're doing. And that's what that's what the biggest thing that upsets people. Sunday, week ago in the morning, I'm in a group of mayors in my county that we all kind of confer with each other on various issues and things that are going on. And we all decided to do a press release in the morning, and we decided to release a letter to our state's Governor Murphy that evening, just trying to stir things up to get somebody to talk to us. And within a couple of days, the state police had set a meeting with mayors. There were 250 mayors there. And since then, it's been a very active give and take, but not with a lot of detail or information, which is very disappointing.
Is this entirely new? Or, I mean, had you ever noticed anything like this before in the skies above your town? And do you think the fact that everyone's talking about it means everyone's looking at the sky and perhaps they're sort of paying more attention to what's flying around above them?
I think it's fair to say that 60-70% of these sightings are planes. We have several, it's New York Metro, we're an hour west. We have landing, pathways for Newark Airport, the New York City airports, other regional airports. But here's the thing, those are very definable. You can look to a certain point in the sky and see every minute and a half an airplane going into Newark International Airport. And you know what they are. It's a 737 descending to 2,000 feet, making approach, or the other airports. We all get that. We see those patterns. We understand that. But these are, when these things work in a grid pattern, or they seem to be programmed to go in certain directions for a length of time and turn back around or hover. Last Wednesday night, the night after I filmed, last Wednesday night, a week ago, not 2 weeks ago, I saw and filmed, but it didn't come out well, a drone that was hovering, and the drones have a red and a green light. One side is their left side, one side is their right side. And I saw a drone sitting and spinning. You could see the red and green lights alternating, but my video didn't come out very well, so it's not very usable. So those are the things that make people realize these are not airplane patterns.
Indeed, and people in your part of the United States know all about aeroplanes, because as you said yourself, you're near lots of airports. You're 50 kilometers from Newark, about the same distance from Central Jersey Airport. I mean, given that you do have these airports nearby, I'm wondering if you've got any other sites or targets in your area that might be the reason, the motivation for some drone surveillance going on above your heads there? I mean, are there some sensitive sites around there?
There's Picatinny Arsenal, which is a weapons development center about 3 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now. They had flyovers. They put a press release that they had unidentified flyovers. There's other military installations here, but there are military installations everywhere. The one very strong question that's been asked for the last month is why New Jersey? It's a densely populated state. And the other thing too that I wanted to share with your viewers, these drones are not hiding. They come out about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Daylight savings here, it's dark by 5. And they're out generally till 10 or 11 p.m. And they are very obvious. They're obviously obvious. Now, there are reports that, and I did see one myself one morning, I couldn't get my camera up ready, that they do go till daylight now, some of them. But why New Jersey and why are they being so obvious in the evening has been the 2 big questions that everyone's asking.
Indeed. Before we crossed here, we heard the President-elect Donald Trump speaking. He's obviously got a property in New Jersey, in Bedminster, says he's probably not going to go there. He's also suggested that the US government is keeping Americans in the dark about these sightings. I mean, do you feel like you're being kept in the dark?
100%. I can tell you, after that White House briefing yesterday, the group of mayors that we text with, we have a texting group. Frustration was over the top. Why did they even take up our time? We got 2 hours notice for the meeting. The meeting started late. 3 mayors got to ask questions, and then they said, "Oh, we're out of time." It was incredibly frustrating. And look, and this is the other thing. Look, the average citizen here, the average person here, the average person around the world knows that the government does things on our behalf that they're not going to tell us, for security reasons, for military reasons, for safety reasons. Our police departments do things, and we don't know what's going on because they don't want us to, because it's not in the benefit of public policy. But what we're hoping for is that the FBI or somebody would level with us and say, look, we know what some of these are, and unfortunately, we're not going to tell you because for security reasons, right? And people can live with that. But it's the unregulated concept. We don't know what they are. We don't really think you're seeing anything. That is where it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and all the while, and in the absence of concrete information, people are filling the void with conspiracy theories, some pretty outlandish ideas out there. Let me put one to you, perhaps not so outlandish, that someone here has tapped into a sense of anxiety nationwide. The country just had a very tense presidential election. There are a lot of drones whizzing around in America. I gather there are about 1 million registered drones. We don't know how many unregistered drones there are. Do you think someone's just cottoned on to the fact they've attracted a lot of attention? The media is watching. Here we are in the Middle East talking to you about it, and they just want to keep it going. This is their moment of glory, and they're having fun at the expense of the United States population.
Yeah,
what do you make of that?
The hobbyist, we'll call it the hobbyist drone community. I've spoken to people in that community. They find this is anti-recreational drone use. They know that this actually could work very hard against their hobby and against this thing that they love, because if it leads to tighter regulation, if it leads to more rules, they're actually working against themselves. To kind of relate it into the president-elect's comments, there is something going on. It may not be to the extent. I mean, I personally know people have called me and said, "There's a drone out there. Go look." I go outside and I'm like, "Ma'am, it's a plane going into Newark Airport." The lady the other night was only because of her anxiety level, not because she's not a good person. Mayor, there's a drone right by the moon. I went out and looked and was like, "I think that's Venus." And she texted after she calmed down. She's like, "You know what? I think you're right. I'm sorry." But that's what it's doing to people. Having something over your head unidentified is stressing people out. And the way that it started here, it started at near President Trump's golf course and home over there. Then it moved to the Morris County area, Picatinny, Morristown Airport. They were all over the place a month ago, 3 weeks ago. And now they're kind of dissipating and moving to other parts of this region. They're moving over the Delmarva Peninsula, Delaware, Maryland. South Jersey has got a lot now. So it's not it's not something that's just, do I think a few hobbyists have jumped in? Yeah, they're probably having a little fun. But there's still real legitimate drone activity up there that's unexplained.
Sure, and I'm going to let you go, Mayor Morris, but just to wrap it up, I mean, you mentioned anxiety. Clearly there's a lot of fear. Do you think mass panic is an exaggeration in terms of the mood right now?
I wouldn't use the word panic. I would just use that anxiety, fear, people are upset. To me, panic would be something where people are going to take action. You know, they're going to get in their car and go somewhere or something like that. I just think it's making people anxious. And there are other people it's not bothering at all. That's the truth, too.
Okay.
But generally, and it's not something people are getting used to. It's not getting easier with time. It's still staying pretty much in the forefront of a lot of people's minds.
Okay. Mayor Sam Morris in Mine Hill Township, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place. Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Sean, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So 1,000 days into this conflict and the war in Ukraine has not been won. In your mind, what are the next steps?
Well, I think you almost have to step back a little bit from that and go, what is achievable now? For the last 2.5 years of the conflict, there's been a view, certainly from the Ukrainian view, we will get rid of Russia. We've been fighting them for 300 years. They've constantly been trying to destroy our language, our communities, our culture, our families. We will prevail, as we always do. But actually, on a visit back there 3 or 4 weeks back, there was much more of a sense of awareness. And that prospect of victory, if that is clearing out Russians from every corner of Ukraine, that seems to be fading fast. And actually, there does feel a much more of a palpable sense of how do we emerge from this with a positive story, positive narrative? How do we emerge from this with our security and our border secure of what remains? How do we rebuild our country? And how do we live, grow and live our life beyond this? Because it's a terrible price that's being paid at the moment. And it's very difficult to see how Ukraine can win in the conventional sense. It's also very difficult to see how Russia can win. And therefore, how do you bring this awful situation to an end? And that involves compromises which are uncomfortable to talk about because all of them have horrible implications. But the bloodshed is just devastating, and on both sides. And that somehow is not sustainable.
How closely tied in your mind is this fatigue that you saw on the ground in Kyiv, for example, in Ukraine more broadly, to the election of Donald Trump in the United States?
One of the questions I asked when I was out there, I had a whole load of questions to ask people. I said, what do you feel about Donald Trump? And they were, of course, all awfully very polite because they know how heavily dependent they are on American aid, particularly. But when you push them a bit, perhaps over a beer, one of the things they said, you do realise we've been fighting Russia for 300 years. Do you really think that one Western politician in 24 hours is going to solve this? And it was a really poignant moment. It felt like, as a Westerner, I was almost trying to impose my will on them, as it were. And it's plain that that's not going to be the answer. I think the trouble is there's lots of implications here. The Trump effect, as a bit of a student of history, if you look back when he came in on the first term, I'm going to build a continuous war with Mexico. Didn't quite manage that. I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. Didn't quite do that. And I'm going to sort out that horrible little man from North Korea. Didn't do that either. But what it did do is a clear intent of where his focus was going to be. And therefore, it's pretty clear, although solving the war in 24 hours is clearly not possible, it's pretty clear where his intent is. Is it to continue supporting Ukraine until the end, or is it about trying to draw the war to an end in some way? What that looks like, probably only President Trump-elect actually knows what that looks like.
Less than 2 weeks from that historic election in the United States, and you have the G20 now reflecting in their statement less of a we must win, continuous and unfiltered or unadulterated support for Ukraine, and also, of course, a realization on the part of European governments that if they're going to do this, they're going to have to go it alone. And when they look at their budgets and their balance sheets, it's just not going to be possible.
No, and if you look at it from literally big picture stuff, the Europeans and the Americans are given about the same amount of money. But if you look at about military aid, the US provides far more because it's got far deeper pockets, it's got far bigger inventories, far bigger war stocks. And therefore, it would be almost impossible for Europe to match. They could potentially dig deeper into their pockets. But it isn't the money that's required, it's manpower and weapons. And those weapons, you can't nip down to the local supermarket and buy them. They take ages to be built, and we've emptied our war stock of those weapons. I think what's interesting from geopolitical, though, again, people are very scared about the Trump effect. They've talked about him walking away from NATO, talked about... I think actually there are some things which I think we've just, although at times the message...
Wasn't he the greatest thing to happen to NATO, though?
Well, in a way, that is my view, that, we had only a third of NATO members were paying their way. And that's not right. As a nation who also pays their way, we don't pay as much as America do, but America spends double the amount proportionally on defence and far more actually in purely quantums. But 2/3 of NATO weren't actually paying their way. Well, why should they enjoy the benefit of security? Since those Trump days, we've now got over 2/3 of NATO paying their way. Is that enough? No. But I do think so. Some of the Trump rhetoric is designed, I think, to say, look, America will look after China. Russia's right on your doorstep. You're feeling the heat there. Europe, step up and sort it out.
Yeah.
And in a way, we're seeing that with Poland, who've doubled their defence budgets. Most of Europe's sweating a little bit, going, if America's not going to sort this out, we need to. What does that look like? And I think that's created a really interesting dynamic in NATO. And it's a harsh reminder that 3 decades of sort of post-Cold War peace dividend are well and truly over.
We have a new Secretary General. He's coming from the Netherlands, Mark Rutte. It's a gentleman I've interviewed on a number of occasions. That's a country that hasn't been paying their 2%. There are questions, of course, about what kind of leadership he's going to bring to the organization. In your mind, does this leave, with the election of Donald Trump, perhaps a window for NATO to become even more cohesive?
I think it'll be a defining moment for NATO. I have to say, part of my scepticism is that if you measure military capability by mass, NATO is a resounding success. You add up all the tanks, add up all the aircraft, it's fantastic. The problem with a committee is that you can only move at the pace of the slowest. And I think we've already found with Ukraine, providing weapons for Ukraine has not been something that all nations agree with. The UK was the first to offer tanks. There was lots of reluctance to offer tanks. And the danger is that NATO, actually, when the UK was providing Storm Shadow, for example, long-range missiles, and America turned around and went, I think you probably don't want to do that until we've all agreed it. And as a result, Putin sat there watching, laughing. He lives in an autocracy where he makes a decision, it happens. Yeah. NATO has some huge benefits, but it's also demonstrating some significant challenges. And there is a view that what do we do if President Putin decides to have a go at Lithuania or Latvia? NATO members. But would NATO roundly sign up for a nuclear war based on going into those countries? Now, the obvious political answer is, of course they would. But I think Putin's already seeing, with his saber rattling, which he's doing regularly, just how nervous the West is, just how nervous. And by forming an alternative to NATO, that sort of axis of evil, potentially North Korea, Iran, China, he's already starting to form an axis of body that's saying we can challenge the West, because they might look big and strong, but actually the glue that ties them together isn't that strong at all.
When you think about how this is all going to look 20 years from now, in your mind, did the West sell Ukraine a raw bill of goods in terms of what they were going to do, what they would be willing to do, and what they could afford to do in support of Ukraine?
So one of the questions I asked when I was out in Ukraine was about the West's support. And what was fascinating, again, they were very polite initially, but their memory of the fall of the Soviet Union, their memory, I mean, if you remember, for the viewers particularly, Ukraine became the third largest nuclear power in the world because the former Soviet Union had forward deployed its weapons into Ukrainian soil. So when the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had all these nuclear weapons. They didn't have the launch codes, but they had the weapons. And as a result, America, the UK, Russia sat down with Ukraine and said, look, it's not healthy for you to have those weapons. We'll guarantee your sovereignty, all of us, if you give up those nuclear weapons. So the Budapest Memo of 1994 was signed. And 20 years later, Putin rips it up and goes into Crimea. Now, where the Ukrainians remember that period is they were coerced. They were forced into signing that. And the only reason they agreed to sign it was because you, the West, guaranteed our security. When we called on that insurance policy, nobody was there.
We've shown them what that's worth.
And I think it's very easy, yes, to criticise Putin for what he did, but he went into Crimea, saw that the West didn't actually do anything, wrote a couple of stiff letters. Really? Is that really what the security guarantees of the Budapest Memo 94 were about? Now, I wasn't there, you weren't there, you know, but I do understand that it's one thing writing something, it's quite another actually doing something.
And that is part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, we've had technically 20 years to understand Vladimir Putin, to understand his red lines, how far he's willing to go. Most people called it wrong when, you know, the invasion happened. Nobody really thought that he would make that move because economically it didn't make sense. Why would you jeopardize your place in the world order? But he did it, and he did it anyway. And it looks as if now, in a sense, he's going to be able to walk away from this quite successfully, because the conversation now seems to be surrounding how do we end this and allow Russia to save face.
Yeah, that sticks in the throat a bit, doesn't it, about saving face. I think if you would be an idealist, and you know, when I was younger I was an idealist, now I'm much more of a pragmatist.
Now you're a grown-up.
You know, the idealist would say, no, you can't hand Russia a victory, because what will that mean? The flip side of that is that there is a view at the moment that Ukraine is locked into an attritional battle. It is the smaller party. An attritional battle, traditionally the smaller party loses. It's a bit like medieval times. We'll meet on the battlefield, have a cup of tea, and then have a go at each other. The strongest, the most numerous tend to win. Well, this attritional battle, unfortunately, is favouring Russia. They're on the front foot in the Donbass. They're on the front foot in the Kursk region. And therefore, if you continue fighting, one of the risks is that Russia actually makes a breakthrough, and all of a sudden it could be a lot more territory. It potentially could be an endgame for Ukraine completely. And therefore, rather than be an idealist and say, look, we're never going to stop until we win or we lose, is there some other very unpalatable, but some other solution? And I sensed from my visit, I sensed from a lot of the conversations I have, and I'm still connected to a lot of very well-informed parts of this landscape. And that sense of what does victory look like, they're fading in its hope rather than expectation. Whereas the expectation of we're running out of people, running out of ideas, and Trump's rhetoric may well just be the final nail in we've got to find an alternative way to draw this to a close. The question then is, how does that appease President Zelensky? Part of it is you've got to rebuild your country. Part of it is we're going to need some security guarantees, and I'm not going to accept a signature on a bit of paper. But also for Putin, how do you actually coerce Putin into signing something or agreeing something? you've got to have a sweetener. He's got all the aces at the moment. If you're going to stop, why stop? So, in a way, I wouldn't be at all surprised if one of the things that will be discussed behind closed doors is stopping some of the sanctions, returning his place. And that's distasteful. But if that is the price of bringing this conflict to an end, is that a price worth paying? And what are the implications of that for Xi Jinping looking at Taiwan?
Well, it's probably an unavoidable price, considering the fact that, we're talking about budgets, we're talking about economies, we're talking about the U.S. government, who, under Donald Trump, will presumably not be willing to spend as much as they have spent. But interestingly enough, we've seen, obviously, the Biden administration making some last-minute pushes, last-ditch efforts, if you will, to continue their policies towards Ukraine. They've got a couple of months left, and even though he is a lame duck, technically, it doesn't seem as if that's keeping them from continuing to push their agenda. Does that leave perhaps some possibilities for Zelensky?
No. The last 48 hours has been fascinating, as we've talked about. Let's be specific. ATACMS, these army tactical missile systems, which are vaunted as the answer to the Maiden's Prayer. They're a supersonic missile. They go ballistic. They go 200 miles. The downside is they've only got a £500 charge in the middle of them. They cost well over $1 million each, and there's not many of them around. So they're very effective at surgical strike, but Russia's already moving its fighter jets out of range of those, so they can't be used. And this
has devolved into a drone war as is.
Well, it's also, I think, the short. We tend to talk about drones as being short range. The debate about long-range weapons, that can the West give them, we're running out of them, can we allow them to use them into Russia? It's become a really convoluted conversation about something which, frankly, is not going to change the course of the war. What has been happening behind the scenes is that Ukraine has been saying, OK, we may not be able to give you these long-range weapons, but if we could give you all of the parts, sensors, rocket packs, explosives, and you assemble them, you can assemble something that's much more modern than we could give you. To the West to develop it would mean we'd have to do safety cases, we'd do lots of safety. You don't have to do any of that. And we've actually seen over the last couple of months Ukraine be a lot more effective at doing deep strikes into Russia.
Yes.
And so the danger is we get this argument seduced about, will the West provide? Actually, this is about, can Ukraine strike deep into Russia? And it is able to do that now. I think the very different question is that these ATACMS, I think, in a way, people say, is this Biden's last? No, it's a really modest step. I think the reason he's done it now, bluntly, is that in the Kursk region, Ukraine has a small enclave. It went in there in August. It's been pushed out of a third of that enclave. Putin will not want to negotiate whilst there's a Ukraine presence on Russian territory. He's going to do everything possible to get that cleared. He's got 50,000 troops up there, apparently 12,000 North Korean troops as well. He is going to be doing everything. Just imagine the instructions he's giving to his commanders. Don't come back until you've cleared that area.
Yes.
Massive casualties, and therefore what it appears that Biden's going is, we need to help you with that enclave. We're not giving you weapons that you can strike deep within Russia. We're giving you weapons that you can strike in Russia as part of protecting that enclave and supporting, holding out for as long as you can. I think that's far more logical than some knee-jerk against Trump, because frankly, the day Trump comes in, he could sign an order saying, no, you can't use them anymore.
Yeah.
Simple.
Instead, President Biden undercut Europe
by doing by putting the weapons in early. I don't buy that. No, the trouble is, this whole weapons thing, I think, is a bit of a non-story. If you need help, I give you weapons. As long as you use them within the law of armed conflict, I shouldn't actually say, we can't do that with them, but you can do that with them.
But that's been the story of this entire conflict.
I know, but because that's been the story of the conflict, when you then take those restrictions away, you provide Putin with the opportunity to wail and shake the nuclear sabre. I mean, that's the irony of this whole thing, that ultimately there shouldn't have been a story about this. It should have been, here's the weapons, use them as you see fit. And the problem by having now is that if Keir Starmer now makes a thing with the media about suddenly, with green light on, I think it'll just happen under the radar. I think he'll just say, President Zelensky, you've got the weapons. Nobody's marking your homework and seeing what's happening. We're not going to make an announcement and play to Putin's game. We've always said you can use the weapons. Let's face it, Lord Cameron had originally said you can use those weapons as you see fit. They were reined in because of the US angle. So I don't think that by playing all this out in public, it doesn't help. And I suspect Keir Starmer rather than going, yes, we're going to confront Putin, is just quietly going to Zelensky, carry on, use the weapons, don't break the law of armed conflict, and we'll continue to support you as best we can.
And so the market chatter that we've heard over the last 24 hours suggesting that this could push President Putin to use nuclear weapons, in your mind, if he was going to do that, he would have already done it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a regular talking about this stuff. I'm grey-haired. I served in the military when we were in the middle of a Cold War. We talked about nuclear weapons. We did nuclear fallout drills on our missions. We were planning one-way missions, never expecting to come back. You know, and then all of a sudden the peace dividend happened. Nobody talked. There's nobody around these days that has lived through that time. And the danger is, therefore, Putin knows it's a really effective, saber to rattle that scares everybody. And it's worked. He keeps saying it, and we step back from the brink. Let's be absolutely clear. If we wanted to stop Russia from invading Ukraine, if we put a no-fly zone in there tomorrow, my colleagues in the air forces would love to have a go at that. Putin struggled against a really old, decrepit air force. Imagine if a 21st century air force to sweep in. He'd be stopped in a heartbeat. We don't want to do that. That's a choice we're making. So we could do it. We've just chosen not to.
Yeah, consistently. In your mind, post-war environment, when we talk about investment in Ukraine, there are investment vehicles at the ready. BlackRock and JP Morgan have one. The idea being, of course, that between the United States and the European Investment Bank, there's going to be billions of dollars worth of investment going into Ukraine. But, of course, that does have implications for insurance, for example, markets, and whether or not, this war is really coming to a close. Security guarantees. Given the lackadaisical way in which we have behaved towards the Ukrainians so far, what kind of security guarantees can they reasonably expect?
It's a great question. I think part of it is there's been a lot of talk about NATO providing it. I have to say it's quite difficult to see how NATO will be the answer. First of all, NATO isn't a club you just come and join. There's all sorts of things. It's a collective. You all have to contribute towards it in some way, militarily, financially, etc. And there's certain standards that I don't think Ukraine will meet for quite some time to come. Quite apart from the fact, you're now Putin, I'm now Zelensky, and we're negotiating an end. If I tell you I'm going to be part of NATO, Putin's going to go, unless that's off the table,
there's no conversation.
There's no conversation. So it's quite difficult to see how NATO is the answer. But that doesn't mean there isn't an answer. There are bilateral, trilateral arrangements that can be made, military bases that are now forward deployed onto Ukrainian soil. There's lots of ways that could make it a lot more difficult for Putin to take a breather for a few years and then start again. Because if he had an American base, a French base, a UK base near the front line of the new border, in whatever that was, that would put a very different dynamic in to the Putin's mind if he thought he was going to take another chunk out of Ukraine anytime soon. So I think there are other ways of providing that security guarantee. I think the financial one is really interesting because at the end of the Second World War, obviously Germany was devastated. That became the powerhouse of Europe.
Yes.
So there is the potential.
Until now.
But there is the potential for Ukraine to be rebuilt and modernised, and this could be the foundations of a brave new future for Ukraine that has had a very difficult 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. A land of opportunity, maybe.
What is your assessment of the sort of European response post-election in the United States? And I'm speaking specifically about the call between Olaf Scholz and Vladimir Putin and the reaction from other European leaders, outrage from Zelensky, but outrage from Emmanuel Macron as well.
Europe's in a slightly difficult position, isn't it? I think.
Well, it's a tough one when the French are the ones that are pushing back the most, right? And being less willing to negotiate.
The trouble is, I mean, at its heart, President Trump says it's America first. Actually, that sounds very provocative, but the reality is every country operates with its own national interest at first. Every country.
Yes.
And so not every country will feel the same heat from Russia. There is a view, I mean, let's face it, most of our countries are suffering a bit of a COVID hangover financially at the moment. Therefore, there's a lot of demand for money internally as well as externally. Now, one argument you could say, Russia's a threat, we have to ramp up our defence spending. When I was in the Ministry of Defence, the two driving threats that drove how much money we spent were Russia and China. Russia has now spent itself. It's lost most of its main battle tanks. It is no longer the threat from an equipment perspective that it was before. Worse than that, we were a little bit scared of it. Now we've seen how inept it is and how poor both the equipment is and also how it operates.
But they are rebuilding and reindustrializing
How long
around
will it
the
take to
military
make that
economy.
happen, though?
Even if it's years, they're up against what we now see is a Europe that is significantly degraded in terms of its economic power.
Yes, but I think if you do the harsh metrics, the West, even without America, is still far overmatches what Russia has. And it's not just in quantity, it's also in quality. Now, does that mean, would we want to take on Russia because of the nuclear threat? Absolutely not. But it does mean that Russia would have to think twice. It was expecting to walk into Ukraine and over a matter of days take Ukraine. 1,000 days later, it is still suffering huge casualties, lost so much equipment. It is not a very potent military machine. And if President Putin had his time again, I wonder whether he'd play his cards quite the same. We were talking earlier that one of the challenges is it's very difficult to know what his motivation is here. Is it because he wants a big stone statue of himself in the Great Hall, like Peter the Great, that he's been part of rebuilding the Russian Empire? He said he wanted to make Russia great again. It's been a bit of a pariah on the world stage. He said he wanted to stop the expansion of NATO. NATO's expanded as a result of it, and Putin himself found himself indicted by the International Criminal Court. It doesn't feel like a very positive outcome, but if he secures that land bridge, the Donbass and Crimea, despite the casualties, he may gloss over that and declare victory. But I think the oligarchs and everybody who actually provides the power base will be going, you paid a massive price for that. We don't want to do that again, do we?
In your mind, what is the best way to position President Zelensky going into these negotiations?
Well, incredibly difficult, because it doesn't matter how you spin it. Ukraine is on the back foot. They are struggling. They've been heavily reliant on international support. That international support is waning. It's not waxing at the moment. The coffers are basically bare. And the defence industrial base of Russia is still ramping up tremendously. They've got oil revenues paying for it all. So it doesn't look like a winning hand. Therefore, how do you create the circumstances where you end up with some form of peace? Now, I'm not entirely convinced that Putin will want to have that conversation. He certainly won't want to be bullied into it. And unless he feels he's won. So I think the answer is less about what Zelensky can stomach. It's more about what will need to be on the table for Putin to consider that actually it's worth his while stopping.
As this war winds down, in your mind, does this help or hurt President Zelensky at home? Are we going to have a Churchill effect post 1945?
I think it's very likely. And I was quite... So one of the questions I was asking when I was out in Ukraine, and it's not a big... I can't speak for the whole of Ukraine, but I thought I would go out and ask, what do they think of President Zelensky? And I was asking loads of people, barmen, all sorts. And I thought they'd all be resoundingly for him. And they looked at me quizzically. And I said, well, from outside, I know nothing about the politics, but this man has cometh the hour, cometh the man. He has stepped up. He's galvanised support internationally. And all of them just went, yeah, he's done that, but he doesn't get my vote.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be drawn on it. And so it is only a tiny dip test, but most wartime leaders struggle over time. That if he's a signal of the resilience of Ukraine, that's great.
Yes.
If he translates to being stubborn, when actually the mood of the country is, I've had enough. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying it's a really difficult time. And it may be I just spoke to the wrong people in Kyiv, but I very much sense he has done a fantastic job in very difficult circumstances. Whether he endures beyond this is a very different question.
Yeah. John, it's great to have you on Al Arabiya. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs,